Okay, I am joined by Damon Binder. Damon, you're a senior researcher on the biosecurity and pandemic preparedness team at Coefficient Giving, last time I checked. And we're going to talk about your series that you've been writing on the AI industrial explosion. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Cool. So let's just start by setting the scene. What's the question that you're trying to answer?
So basically, the question is, how fast will the economy grow as we get more and more powerful AI systems? So people just have very, very different intuitions about this. On the one hand, you might have the conventional kind of economist view. I mean, over the last few hundred years, we've seen very impressive economic growth by historical standards, a few percent per year. You know, some countries have achieved growth rates up to 10% per year if you look at something like China, but that has been during periods of catch-up growth where they're quite technologically behind. And, you know, despite having seen quite radical technological change in the last 30, 50 years, you know, we've seen computers, the internet, iPhones, and so forth, the economy itself has consistently grown a couple percent. So the economist view is to look at these new AI systems that we're developing and think, oh, great, that'll be what gives us the next, 10, 20, 30 years of a couple percent growth.
Yep.
On the other hand, you'll have, I guess what you might call like the, very like futurist or technologist view of AI, which is that it's not just any old technology. That this is, the technology that we could use to automate basically all of human labor. Like, if you do develop something that's genuinely artificial general intelligence, in the original sense that the term was used before it became a watered down marketing term, well, that is an AI system that you could set up to do any human task. And like, that doesn't just mean that you'll like spend a bunch of engineering effort to like work out how to, put the model in the right context. You'll ask it, oh, can you do this job for you? And it'll say, oh, yes. And, it'll teach itself how to do the job. And like any other human employee, it'll like work things out. Like, you won't have to wait or do a bunch of crazy stuff to like put it in your workflow. You just, talk to it like you would any other employee, and it'll help you. And furthermore, once you have this intellectual work, you could also have, robotics systems that in fact, in the real world, control systems. And so their view is something along the lines of, this is like having a human printer or something. Like, it's at the moment that we don't have any workers, there's this limited amount of stuff you can do. What if you could just like, build more workers? Well, surely the economy would grow really fast. I mean, like, you could just, produce huge amounts of things. And therefore, we should expect growth rates that are much closer to like the physical limits of growth. Like cyanobacteria, they double every day.
Yeah.
Why couldn't we make things that also double every day?
Yeah.
So like growth
Jump right
rates,
ahead there.
growth rates should
spoilers.
be, hundreds of times faster than today. That's kind of the two, I guess, diametrically opposed views or something.
I guess to take what I might say is the consensus economist position, as far as there is one, in fairness, there is something kind of strange about how, post-war growth rates, at least in developed economies, has been very consistently like 3-ish%. And that has required just constant new technologies, right? If you held the technology level fixed, growth levels would have to decline. And so you might think, well, thank God AI is coming around. This is just the next wave of technology required to sustain 3% growth. Like, it's really not given that we keep getting these new technologies. There is a bar to meet, which is like not trivial to go beyond that.
Kind of. I mean, I think it is actually kind of tricky to work out what is determining the growth rate and whether, like, to what extent this is a feature of like the technologies themselves. There's also like a lot of questions about how you actually measure GDP growth and things like this. I'm not an expert, but I think it's like important to flag that, like, to what extent is this like few percent growth rate a feature of technological progress versus a feature of, I guess, like kind of institutional progress, or like kind of the incentives that exist to develop new ideas versus a question around like, actually, is this mostly to do with the way we like actually depreciate and measure growth? I mean, what is $1 today worth compared to $1 in 1970? Like, how expensive?
Yeah, fascinating questions, and we have no time to discuss them. But no, great points. Maybe say a bit about where this work came about. I mean, there's a lot of important things that you could be working on.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, it just is a really important question, how fast the economy will grow once you have AI, because it's the difference between having many decades to deal with the problems and to think them through versus within a few months going from something that looks maybe like today to like crazy new technologies And there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about AI, but like one particular one is just concentration of power that you see with, if you have fast growth rates, then people who in fact invest or are ahead of the curve or whatever could end up with controlling vast like physical technologies. Another one is that there just are like the potential for much more destructive wars or conflicts if you had a lot of autonomous weapons, for instance. And well, how fast can you produce the autonomous weapons? Well, if the economy is growing, 200% per year, then like you could see really rapid build outs, like much faster than you'd historically expect. On the other hand, obviously, if the economy is growing slower, then like you just don't have the same kind of ability to produce massive amounts of stuff, basically.
Yep. So there are 4 parts in this series.
So
fourth one. Okay, great.
So far, there's unlimited number of parts.
Okay, they're actually going to double every year.
Exactly.
Each part, I guess you kind of relax more and more assumptions, but we can just start with the first part and move through them. So just tell me about part 1. What are the assumptions? What's the model?
How do we make progress on working at how fast the economy grows? Well, it's just, you need data. So the question is like, what information about the world do we actually have? And fortunately, it turns out that economists collect huge amounts of production data. Like, it's called input-output analysis. Basically, what you do is you look at the economy and you go around and you ask people like, okay, like how many things did you get from different sectors? Like, what did you purchase in your factory? What kinds of capital, like what kind of stuff do you have in your factory? How much is that worth? And then like, what do you produce out? Like, how much value have you added? And you collect this data for basically every sector in the economy. And that basically gives you like a sense of, okay, who in the economy purchases what and what do they do with it? And so that's what input-output analysis studies. And the basic things that go into producing stuff, you've got the like kind of flow goods, like the inputs. Like if you're making a car, for instance, you'll need like steel, you'll need panels, you'll need like electronic equipment that'll come into your factory. And every car you make, you need like every car will need like a certain amount of steel and a certain amount of rubber and whatever. And so every car consumes a certain amount of that. You also will have machines and the physical capitals, like the factory shell itself. And that is kind of the physical capital that is owned. And that is amortized over many cars. And then you'll have the laborers. So like you'll have to pay people to in fact like run the business and, machine parts and things like this. Obviously in a modern car factory, a lot of it's highly automated. So a big pattern over the last century or more is that human labor has been steadily replaced by this physical capital. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this input-output analysis, all of this data about like what car factories use, what dentists use and whatever. We're going to ask, let's just say that the labor was free. How fast would the economy grow? Now, at the moment, the economy just can't grow that fast because labor isn't free. Like you could try and build more stuff, but you just wouldn't have the people to man the factories. But once the labor is free, this becomes like a closed problem. You ask, well, cool. How much stuff can everything produce? How many more factories and machines and physical capital could that stuff make? And then if that machines and capital, the machines and the factories and things make more stuff, which is used to make more machines and physical capital, okay, like how fast can this kind of flywheel go?
Could you not say that, okay, currently the labor share in developed economies like roughly 50%. So if labor were free, if wages fell to 0, then that just gives you roughly twice as much money to reinvest in capital. And so, waving your hands a bit, seems like that means that, okay, growth rates can be like roughly twice as fast, and that's it. Because you're still bottlenecked by the number of people. So is there anything else going on? Am I missing something?
So we have always lived in a regime where like workers are limited. And so we just kind of baseline, our intuitions about how the economy works are all based on this. But what I'm asking is like a different question. Like if you have a machine that self-replicates, like basically the economy becomes like a self-replicating machine. And so the question is like, how fast can that reproduce itself?
Yeah, so I guess maybe part of the story here is not just that labor is free or very cheap, but it's also accumulable. You can effectively create more labor.
Yeah, well, so I mean, so basically the underlying belief here is that you'd replace the labor with some form of physical capital. So you'd replace it with robots and compute and stuff. And so the simplest version of this is to imagine like it's literally free. Like AI is so good that you have like your single computer chip that, is so intelligent, it solves everything, and the robots are so cheap or whatever. We can chat about like how to add labor into the models, but like basically, yeah, if labor were free, like if you just didn't have to worry about this at all, then like, well, there's no bottleneck for you just like accumulating more and more physical capital. And so you just get this like rapid growth.
Yep. Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe we should just start with the simplest version. So, robots and human level cognition, it's just free. You can make it instantly.
Yeah, so you just like snap your fingers, you have all the robots you need to do everything.
That doesn't obviously mean that you can just grow arbitrarily fast, because you're still bottlenecked by just physical stuff. How much can you grow and how quickly? So what are you bottlenecked by?
Basically, the economy is like a large set of things that feed into other things that feed into other things. So like isolating what the one bottleneck is a bit tricky, because in some sense, everything kind of bottlenecks everything else. The sector that has the slowest payback time is the energy production sector or sectors. So I mean, in the IO tables, usually you have fossil fuel extraction sector, like gas and oil extraction, and then you'll have the electrical production and grid sectors. And these together represent primary energy production. And what you find is that at the moment, the capital, so the stuff that is used to make energy, itself takes energy to build. So like if you build a solar panel or a wind turbine, or you build a gas pipeline or whatever, it takes energy to smelt the steel or to make the silicon wafer or whatever. And so if you look at the total energy that is in those systems and you ask, how long would it take the system to get enough energy to build another copy of itself? You find this energy payback time is usually on the order of a year. So this is probably the most tightly bottlenecked single sector. If you ask like how much does the sector need itself to build itself?
Interesting.
Now, other things that are pretty slow, so construction is also a fairly slow sector to reproduce itself. Like if you ask what other sectors end up bottlenecking, well, if energy were free, you still find the growth rate is about a couple 100% per year. So energy is the most tightly bottlenecked sector, but it is not the only bottleneck. And once you remove energy and you're like, say, let's just assume energy is totally free, just like snap your fingers, energy, you get it. Then you find that it's in fact like the production of machine tools and of whole like factory shells. And so basically like all of the machinery that makes machinery ends up being the bottleneck.
And I guess just to get clear in my head, so the kind of current working assumptions are labor is roughly free in the sense that you can just add more of
snap
it
your fingers,
as much as you want.
More workers, yeah.
I guess you could imagine you could just get as many people as you want, just kind of appearing out of nothing to do more and more work. But also currently assuming that the kind of other technologies are not changing. So currently not imagining kind of sci-fi new production methods. So it's just current factory technologies, manufacturing, power generation.
Importantly, it's not just current. Yeah. So it's not just like existing technologies. If you look at the input-output table, so these are like US economists. So like you could look at tables for other countries. They've basically gone around and looked at every different part of the economy and asked like, how much do you put in and how much do you like build out? And so this is like literally the current production methods with no changes whatsoever. So if like a current method, buys lunch for the workers, then if you just naively take the input-output tables, that lunch will appear as like, an input from the catering sector. And so, if you just naively use the tables, like you'll include like buying some food for the workers as part of the input there. Obviously, you wouldn't do that if you had robots, but
which is going to be a reason to expect these current numbers are going to be more conservative than what you might actually get.
Exactly, because there's a whole hierarchy of different changes you could make, all the way from like removing lunch to like maybe you should change what you produce or how you produce it, because some things will become much more expensive or cheaper. When labor is free.
Yeah, got it. And then again, just to say some of this back, the question is not so much how do we go from the world today to a very fast-growing world, but just how fast could a fast-growing world look like with these assumptions?
So the maximum growth rate, so you have like a bunch of different sectors of the economy, like you'll have the steel production and you'll have like construction and dentistry and pharmaceutical goods and so forth. Today, the economy is not at all distributed among these sectors for optimal growth. Like most of the economy produces consumer goods. We consume most of what we produce. For an optimal growth state, basically it's heavily indexed on construction, energy production, raw resource extraction, because those are the things you need to build more stuff. And so the maximum growth rate is really a question about this hypothetical world in which like you move everything around so that you have...
You're like reinvesting everything.
Exactly. And so like if you imagine that you started on a desert island and you're trying to grow things fast, well, ignoring economies of scale issue, like obviously if you have a single person, like tiny factories, like things become inefficient. But like once you get a certain amount of scale, this will be the growth rate you would achieve if you're trying to grow really fast. If you also imagine you started with today's economy and you tried to grow really fast, but using, again, the same methods, you would converge this growth rate over time. So basically, like, you'd start by having kind of like the core of the really fast growing economy, but then you have all these like kind of superfluous industries, and you'd spend like a lot of time growing basically your energy production and your mining and whatever, and you just kind of ignore everything that you don't really need. And so after a few years or whatever, you would eventually get to the stage where you were growing at this fast growth rate, and kind of everything else around you had kind of converged to this because you just grown so much that
So you're saying the economy today is currently composed in a way to cater to people's, consumption preferences. We consume a bunch of output rather than reinvesting everything.
Yeah.
If we wanted to reconfigure the economy just to grow as fast as possible, given these constraints we've talked about, then, the kind of haircut and beauty products sectors are presumably going to shrink.
Exactly.
And things like, manufacturing and energy production are going to grow. Yeah, there are other kind of sectors which are going to be like a big part of this fast-growing economy.
I think basically when you look down the list of what are the biggest sectors, it just ends up being, energy production, mining, smelting of minerals, the machine tools, and all of the machinery that makes machinery. Now, it's actually kind of tricky to even measure this. So input-output tables, they do things and they denominate things in dollars, which is just like a unit of account. Like it's not, so you could equally do the analysis in terms of like physical mass of stuff or any other unit you like, and you'll get the same answers, but except insofar as the sectors are averaging over different products. So like if you have 5 different products, you have to work out like how do you combine them together. And so the input-output tables use dollars, and this causes some potential artifacts. But overall, you can see kind of like the size. But as the economy grows really fast, these dollars don't mean anything. Like, just because something costs like $1 today doesn't have any meaning in the future economy. But if you do like naively look how much bigger it has to be than today's economy, you find the things that need to be really big are things like machine tools. Like I think you find it has to, if I remember correctly, it has to be like hundreds of times bigger than car, like relative to the rest of the economy. Just because at the moment we just don't produce, we don't need to replicate that many factories.
Yep. There's much more of a kind of Factorio world.
Exactly. And this is exactly how you should think about it. It's like you're playing like Factorio.
Yeah.
You can like copy paste the things that we do today, but you can rearrange them how you like. So you're still doing the same processes, but you're just trying to like build it to like wire everything together to be as fast as possible.
Yeah, cool. Let's think about making this thought experiment more realistic. One question would be, currently you're assuming that everything is reinvested, all outputs reinvested. If this is a world where humans are still knocking about and they want to consume, presumably this is all happening for a reason, then what happens to growth rates if some similar fraction of output as today gets diverted towards consumption?
So this is in some sense like one of the trickiest questions to reason about. So if we ask the question of like how fast can the economy grow assuming fast reproduction, that's really a question about like physics, economic, engineering. If you ask the question, okay, how fast will the economy grow given savings? Well, the question then becomes what drives savings. It's actually really tricky because there are like lots of different reasons you might save. I mean, economists obviously have models of saving rates, but to be frank, they're very underdetermined.
Yes.
But even if you like try and like look at whether they predict current behavior in various macro contexts, I think that they are not. There's not great empirical evidence that they're good choices. Basically, I mean, like if you look at the classical models of savings, they're basically just like what's convenient to solve mathematically, and they have like roughly the right kind of mathematical vibes, but to do quantitative work with, it's just really not that plausible. It's also unclear whether they can apply across different contexts. If you're asking, cool, like how much are you willing to pay for a sandwich in 6 months versus today or whatever, that's quite different to asking like, okay, how much would like an economy like save over 6 months? It's not clear that it aggregates, for instance. It's quite tricky to answer, but kind of roughly how you could think about it. So the broad question is like, what's the savings rate? If you save half of, basically if you save 100%, that means everything you produce, you reinvest to make more factories. If you save 50%, that means like half of the stuff you produce, you like use to make more factories. The other half you like, I don't know, set on fire or make like pretty mansions or like drone armies to like conquer your foes. If you save 50%, then that halves the growth rate. If you save 90%, then you 10% reduction in growth rate. So basically, if you're probably, if you find that the maximum growth rate is like 100% per year, it would be surprising if the true growth rate was not like I don't know, like roughly half that, or like a third that, or two-thirds that, or something. Because you would require otherwise, like, you're really consuming almost everything that you produced in order to get, like, you know, a 90% haircut. So I think once you start looking at very fast growth rates, it's implausible to see how savings could like could drag you down back to like a few percent growth rate. It could definitely be the difference between like doubling every 6 months and doubling every 9 months or every year or something.
Yeah. And I guess I should have asked much earlier, what numbers are you actually imagining when you do try to run this thought experiment?
So it's very tricky for various reasons. I think the kind of input-output analysis we've been talking about, to my mind, makes it very hard to see how you could have doublings that were below, like, were slower than a couple years or something. Like, I think even if you assumed, like, a high savings rates and a bunch of regulation, it seems quite tough to prevent growth rates of, like, a couple, like, doubling times of a couple years or faster. You'd have to be also, like, extremely high enforced, like, you know, very low savings rates that were basically enforced by regulation, and they have to be enforced among basically everyone. You know, if 90% of people are like, I don't care, I'm just gonna like not get more stuff, and then someone decides to go to Angular and like build a lot of stuff, then like, well, Angular will become like the powerhouse of the world very quickly.
Yeah, I guess there's this point that if growth rates are potentially very fast, then anyone who, you know, defects or decides to capitalize on them would very quickly come to
exactly
disproportionately grow.
And so this is quite different from, say, the current economy. So like countries do today like vary quite a bit in savings rates. Obviously, if you save more, then you'll grow faster. But if you're a country and you look at the difference between, you know, a 2% versus 4% growth rate from savings, I mean, obviously that matters a lot over decades and centuries. But if you're a politician and you're a leader of a country or whatever, you're probably just not overly concerned. Like, it's just not that relevant for your current calculus. Like, the difference between a 2% or 4% growth rate, like for geopolitics, it doesn't matter that much. If you're in a world in which like countries can double their output in a year, it really matters. Not just in the long run, the long arc of history. It really matters over the next like couple years, whether you in fact do double every year or you double every 2 years. Like that is the difference between being, you know, remaining like well ahead of your geopolitical rivals and being like absolutely crushed. And so I think like another competition at every level basically means that like the faster the growth rates, the kind of harder it is to avoid this very rapid growth by some actors. Like, you really do need to prevent any individuals from trying to like any smaller actors from doing this, and this kind of occurs like at all levels of both like individuals, it occurs at companies, it occurs at countries.
Yeah. And I guess in some sense it can be deliberate, as in you anticipate these dynamics and you decide to get ahead of them by growing fast, maybe against, you know, what you might otherwise prefer. It can also just be, as it were, accidental, right? Just like there's some variance in how fast different actors grow.
The faster inherit the world or whatever, like how the Amish eventually will, you know.
Yes. Yeah. From race to BC. I guess another thing to ask about is, at the beginning, you were assuming that labor is approximately free. Presumably it won't be literally free, both because it costs money to, you know, buy and operate compute, and also because it costs money to build and operate robots.
Yeah.
How much of a difference does it make when you try to set realistic numbers there?
So, I mean, setting realistic numbers, the question of what you should compare it to, or you should assume. For robots, I think, you know, obviously we are not at the stage where we can build robots that can replace human functionality, but, you know, but once we can, like, it seems quite plausible that it would cost on the order of like a car or something like this. Basically, like, okay, how much material do you need to make a robot? Like, how many parts do you need? Well, it's just like, isn't that hard to make a robot? Like, you know, cars are quite complicated. Cars are more expensive in that they're bigger, but they're somewhat less complicated internally or whatever. But like, I think basically, if you look at current, you know, humanoid robot costs, you look at what it needs to produce or whatever, you know, with a few $100,000, you can buy humanoid robots that can probably do most of the functions you would need for a human worker. With economies of scale, you can probably get this much cheaper to look more like actual like mass-produced cars on the order of $30,000. I really don't see any reason to expect like it to be that hard to make humanoid robots. I think cars are a reasonable benchmark. There's also worth remembering that like humanoid robots is not the way you'd probably do this as you got better and better. Like, you might imagine having a lot more, like, you know, if you're making a self-driving car, you don't make a humanoid robot to sit in the driver's seat. You would just like put some chips in the car so the car can self-drive.
Yeah, the kind of transitional form factor, right, for a world that's built for humans.
Yeah, there's both transitional and another reason is that it's simple to analyze, because we want to analyze how fast the economy grows using like hard data. We want to be able to like actually say things. The current input-output tables assume that humans are being used to make stuff.
Yeah.
obviously you might want to replace the humans with like small quadcopter drones or like those cute dog like robots that you see walking around sometimes or whatever. But I don't know how to, I don't know like how many dog robots you need to like replace that or like, but obviously like a humanoid robot, we just actually have the data because humans do this task. Yeah, if you want to compare it to things in today's economy, it does seem like roughly analogous to building a car, both in terms of like cost and in terms of like the kinds of parts you need. You probably need like fewer materials and somewhat more complicated assembly or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the easy one. The compute's harder because there's a real question of like, well, how cheap could human intelligence be in the limit? I mean, at the moment, it's clear that current AI systems are not capable of automating most human labor. The situations where they can kind of automate labor, they are quite a bit cheaper than humans. Like per token, for instance, or when they do like coding tasks, I think it's usually like they perform them for like a few percent of the cost of the human labor. There was a Redwood research article that laid that quite well. And in fact, it's been kind of consistent over time. So it's not, you might imagine that, the progress we've made in like doing better and better coding tasks has been because the models have we're spending more and more money. It's like a compute thing. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be this. It seems to be the case that instead, as the models have gotten better, we've been able to do more and more tasks for roughly like between like 1 and 100% what it would cost a human to do. So that's one benchmark you might imagine. Maybe if we extrapolate forward, as the AIs get better and better, we'll eventually be able to do everything for like 10% of human cost. Another way we can try and benchmark it is just to ask like, what is the human brain computing? And like, if we wanted to do the human compute, like how would we replicate that with a machine? And here there's a report by Joe Carl-Smith. A few years ago, CG, the estimates are very uncertain, but it seems likely that you could produce human equivalent compute for something like 10 to the 15, 10 to the 18 flops per second. Probably closer to 10 to the 15, but with broad uncertainty. But most of the uncertainty range ends up, if you compare to like, okay, if you were to use like an H100 to do this, being reasonably cheap compared to a human, like 10 or 100 times cheaper or 1,000 times cheaper. There's obviously a bunch of other advantages. I spent a lot of time thinking about like food or like, other things that are not.
Yeah, most of your time.
Mostly just food. Mostly just food.
Yeah, I understand.
Obviously, a lot of that compute is not needed for actually like doing my job. Or like I spend a lot of time. Yeah, I do spend a lot of time sleeping. Sometimes I walk or do like various motor activities that like, it's not clear I'd need, strictly speaking, in order to. So like clear there's like a lot of inefficiency in how humans do this. Now also, humans are probably not the peak of of plausible intelligence. So it's possible you could get a lot of scale advantages or other ways improvements. Also, once you start having a bunch of humans working together, there's like huge inefficiencies in companies and like. If you replace like 1,000 human workers with like a single AI system organizing a lot of the thought, like you might imagine there's just like pretty significant gains to this.
Yeah, I guess both in robotics and thinking about compute and replacing cognitive labor, it seems like there's a very similar pattern, which is for the sake of, just analytical tractability, it's useful to think about, can you have like a drop-in replacement?
Yeah.
That is like, some fraction cheaper or, some dollar level to build. But then in fact, there's this kind of enormous like range of capabilities that the machines and AIs could have, which are, spiky, to use a popular phrase, right? So even today, there are like tasks which are basically arbitrarily cheaper or faster to do with machines than for humans to do. And it's kind of much, much thornier to consider what that might imply for growth rates.
And critical for the analysis I'm doing here with this input-output, we can obviously imagine machines and robots being like very cheap or whatever. I have a pretty conservative assumption in the blog post, which is just like, imagine the robots are like cars, imagine the compute is like an H100, and it's like literally just replace humans with this or whatever. And what I find is that even at those costs, when you don't make any other optimizations, it's actually just like not a very large fraction of the cost. Again, it's a bit hard to quantify exactly because like dollars don't really mean anything when you're talking about an economy that looks very different. But like I find the growth rate is only slowed down by I think like 5 or 10% or something. Once you
factor for the fact that labor is not exactly free.
Exactly. So what you're finding is actually the real thing that's expensive is all of the machinery and stuff that is needed to produce all the machinery. To produce all the machinery.
Yep.
And like once you include the robots, it's just not that adding that much. And if you think about it, this actually isn't that surprising. I mean, I think earlier you mentioned like a stylized fact about the economy is roughly half of the money is spent on physical capital and half on labor. How much does a human worker cost? Well, I mean, probably like a few $100,000, all things considered. I mean, it's not just the cost of the literal person doing the work, but also the person who has to pay their payroll and all of the safety stuff. And, there's a bunch of costs. So a few $100,000, if you can build it for $30,000 naively, well, it's like a tenth of the cost. Well, if you just like magically snap your fingers, that would be like, well, now the capital is like 90%, and the robots that are replacing the labor is like an additional 10% capital. So it would be 10% slower. So like, and in fact, like, the actual input-output table calculations are a bit more complicated than that. But like, basically the conclusion holds out. Like, yeah, you would just, get to be in a state where the labor replacing capital is a small fraction of the total capital.
Yeah, I got it. Another question I had is it not a bit silly to be thinking about these steady state growth rates when we have these potentially bottlenecking factors that could run out after not many doublings, where maybe the most obvious one that people might mention is just raw resources, right? So there are all these kind of critical material inputs to a physical economy. Seems like, according to some people, we're quite close already to hitting limits. I guess not literally running out in most cases, but at least extraction becomes so expensive that could just drag growth rates down. So what do you make of that?
I think this is mostly a misunderstanding of, it's helpful to understand what are the things we can and can't produce. And this comes down to basically a question of physics. If there's a chemical process to be done, we can do chemistry very well. If you want to make new nuclei, you just can't, basically. So the question is like, what are the raw materials you need from the planet? And the answer is basically like the elements. You need to be able to get the right elements. And if you can't get a certain element from the environment, then like there's not really a way to get it otherwise. On the other hand, once you have the right elements to make something, like you can make it. Like there's not other bottlenecks to making. Assuming you can make it from some way or other. Like you can probably start with like whatever combination of the elements and like make it if you're willing to expend enough energy. And so you can just look at the periodic table and you ask like which are the elements that are abundant, which are the ones that are rare, which ones do we actually need to produce stuff in the world. And now this splits basically depending on where the elements come from or whatever. But the bulk elements you need to make stuff, carbon, oxygen, iron, aluminium, these are available in such like vast quantities, we're just never going to run out, functionally speaking. So actually, in my latest part, I've been trying to estimate what like a kind of a minimal electrical production system would look like. And I have, looked at all of the different elements you need within there. And I don't think that there's really much requirement for any mineral that would actually run out. There might be some catalysts you want to use. And so that can kind of become binding once you want to cover the entire planet in solar panels. But you usually don't need these in like very large quantities. And there's a question of substitutes, basically. Like, can you substitute other things? People often talk about like rare earths being uncommon. Like, this is not quite true. There's actually like plenty of rare earths around. The main issue there is that it's just not economical to extract them in most places. But once you start reproducing the economy very fast, then like, well, if it is important, like it will become economical to extract. Like, it's just not currently economical to extract. And obviously, like using current production methods and current labor and whatever, like it would take years to build the capacity. So like no one bothers. If you're reproducing things very fast, then like you'd just be able to reproduce those things very fast. Like it wouldn't be a bottleneck to you. There are some elements that are in fact kind of rare. So copper, zinc, and lead, for instance, are all largely associated with sulfur, and for various reasons, basically are pretty rare on the surface of the planet, except in certain deposits. So if you like look, for instance, if you look at like all the rocks on the surface, and you ask like what fraction of copper is in each rock, it's kind of very bimodal. There's basically like stuff that is economic to extract, and then there's like a big gap, and then there's basically like bulk copper in bulk rock.
Yep. Convenient fact about our planet, by the way, that it's not homogeneous.
Yeah, it is. It's actually kind of incredible to think about, like the fact that all of these processes have like existed that have helped to concentrate, helpfully concentrated a bunch of these. And so for something like copper, like you are in fact quite limited in how much copper there is available. So I think it's like plausible for things like copper and zinc. We just can't economically extract much more than current reserves, maybe like tenfold more than reserves or whatever. Like reserves increase over time as people try harder, but because of this bimodality, we will end up in, it's like not that crazy to imagine as you try and grow, that you will in fact push past the first peak And then it becomes extremely expensive, and I think probably like impractical to really extract past that first peak, except for very niche applications. But you don't actually need any of these resources. Like, they're not strictly necessary for any industrial process. Like, copper you can replace with aluminium. It'll suck. It'll be annoying, like things will be more expensive. But like at the end of the day, you can just eat that cost. And this is like just a basic fact about how, basically the economy works. It's made of lots of different things. If you have 100 different things, each of like is 1% of the cost, and one of them becomes 10x more expensive, you only increase the total cost by like 10% because it's just a small fraction of the total economy. And this is just going to be true of basically all of the things that might be scarce. They're just generally either not that scarce. Like, you could either spend more money to get them, or you would be able to substitute. I don't really see anything that is actually like hard bottlenecking.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I also wonder about a more hand-wavy argument to the effect that, in modern history, so, since settled societies, we've already passed through just many ooms of physical growth, manufacturing capacity, and so on. And as far as I know, I don't think there are any goods that we've stopped being able to produce because we've just run out of some kind of bottlenecking raw input.
I guess I think we've like occasionally driven some things to extinction. Although I think in fact in practice, I don't think there's I think the only time I know, at least like culinarily, is silphium was apparently picked to extinction in ancient Rome. But that's a bit obscure. Yeah, I mean, things have definitely been bottlenecky. Or like, there's always. I think the thing is, there's always going to be something that is the biggest bottleneck on growth.
Yeah.
But separate from it being, unavoidable
or dragging like overall growth rates to some.
And so to say the most interesting example has been like fossil fuels, were somewhat bottlenecky. Like, it is interesting to ask, like, could you in fact have grown the economy really fast? Like, could you have gotten an industrial revolution without fossil fuels being around? I think it's not actually that clear. Like, it is, they are like pretty hard to replace. But if we look going forward, we just can produce energy from solar or nuclear. Or
I was going to say, in this scenario, you're imagining this being gas powered or solar powered, or
I think in practice it'll probably be solar powered. If you just wanted to produce energy really fast, probably gas would be your best bet. But it would just produce a lot of CO2. It seems like, and it's not that much faster than solar. There's a lot of gas. I mean, you eventually would run out of gas, but there's actually quite a lot of gas. There's a lot of coal as well. So I don't think you'd be bottlenecked by actual availability of the energy. You'd probably just be bottlenecked by producing a lot of CO2 and that being quite bad. I suppose you could try and like scrub the CO2 out. So maybe you could maybe it'd be better to like spend that money rather than doing solar panels. But like, when I was doing the math, it didn't seem obvious that one was much like, it wasn't like one was orders of magnitude better than the other. They both seemed to be able to reproduce themselves in the order of like a few weeks or a couple months or something. I think nuclear probably wouldn't be a great way to produce energy, just because I think it'd be too slow. When you have rapid production, you have to include not just kind of like how fast you could produce things. If things are produced infinitely fast, you have to also worry about like how long does it take to produce things.
Right, just absolute lags.
Exactly.
And do you mean, is that in the fuel extraction, or is that just standing up new nuclear power plants?
So I think in terms of standing up new power plants, because they're quite capital intense. There's just a question of like how many weeks or months does it take you to in fact make all the pieces you need and assemble them together, and in fact check everything's going to work, it's going to blow up on you, and so forth. And that it is a lot less modular than like literally rolling out like a thin film solar panel, for instance.
I think I see this yesterday, but you might think, well, the reason it takes a long time to build nuclear power plants compared to solar or gas is because the regulatory environment is just much more onerous. And if you want to just, zoom away those constraints, then can we just build nuclear power plants roughly as quickly as other kinds of power generation?
Yeah, so I think the answer here is that no, they're just like harder to build. Something like it just, I mean, obviously there's a lot of questions like how would you optimally build a nuclear plant, or solar panels for that matter, if you're trying to like build it really fast. And so I mean, I could be missing some like very fast designs or whatever, but just if you think about like literally the scale of production, like you can build a tiny solar panel and like get electricity out of it. You can't build like a tiny nuclear power plant, and so it just seems like a harder technology to build really, really rapidly. Things would be much faster than they are today. So I think like building a nuclear power plant within like 3 or 6 months is probably like not that insane, but building it within 3 weeks, it becomes really tough.
So we've been talking a bunch about how quickly could the economy grow if you can fully automate human labor. even holding technology fixed. There's a question about how we get from here to there, or even whether we would go there. Yeah, how do you think about that kind of transition? Could the transition potentially just take a very long time?
There's two questions to keep in mind here. So the first one is like, okay, like, how fast will it happen in the real world? And the second question, which is the easier one that I deal with in part 2 of my blog post, is like, let's assume, snap our fingers, we magically already have the robots and the AI. How quickly does it happen then? And the reason it's important to distinguish these is by the point that we get AGI that can automate all of human labor, plausibly the economy will have changed quite a lot. Like, as already, as we've been discussing, like you can produce a lot more stuff if you can automate, a bunch of stuff. So maybe if you've automated half of human labor, 3 years before you've automated all of human labor, then like you'll be in a pretty crazy world already. But it's also much harder to reason about because you need to know the trajectory basically of the technology. Like, how fast does AI get really cheap? How long does it take to develop the robots? How much R&D is involved, or so forth. So as a simple toy way to think about it, let's instead assume that we can in fact produce these robots, and we can in fact produce these computer chips and AGI systems that can do this. Like, how fast would it take to grow very rapidly? And so this becomes a question about, if you're an optimal planner and every time step you have to ask, what do I invest the stuff, what do I produce with my factories? And then where do I put the stuff I produce to make new factories? And like, how do I do this so that over the long run, I grow as fast as possible? And basically there's a result in economics called the Turnpike theorem that tells you that if you want to grow, regardless of what your objective is, if you want to grow like something in the long run, the best solution is always to move to this maximal growth rate state where everything's growing as fast as possible, grow as fast as possible for as long as possible, and then at the end you might want to like then so chuck everything into like,
you're a central planner.
Yeah.
The only thing you care about is manufacturing as many paperclips as possible.
Exactly.
Actually, the way to do this is just to grow the economy.
Yeah, exactly. So you grow the economy really fast, and then right at the end, you put everything in paperclips.
Yeah.
But so this is quite a key result in economics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask, okay, like you're the central planner, and like let's just assume at the start, like you're just maximally saving. Like your entire aim is just to grow the economy really fast. How quickly does this transition take? So I find that given starting from the US current point, it takes like a few years basically. And so the reason I guess it's helpful to first think of a toy example. Like, let's say you could double the economy every year, and you wanted to add the maximum growth rate is doubling every year. And you're like, okay, cool. Like, how long would it take the US economy to get to the state? Well, the current US economy only probably maybe around 20% or something is in manufacturing. And so the issue is at the moment, most of the stuff in the US economy isn't able to double very fast. And so you start with a low baseline. But the stuff that is able to double very fast, well, doubles very fast.
Yep.
And so, if you only start with, a 10% of the US economy, but that 10% doubles every year, then after the first year now, you've got 20%. The economy is growing like 10% in the first year, but then that 20% becomes 40%, that 40% becomes 80%, that 80% becomes 160%. So in the first few years, things are slow because basically you got rapid exponential growth, but of a tiny sector of the economy. And then, so it takes you a few years to get to the point where you've doubled production. But then once you've doubled production once, the next doubling occurs very quickly, because now all of a sudden that sector that was growing very fast is now it has become the same size as the economy, and the next year it doubles again.
Yeah, I got it. I guess this is making me think of Baumol style arguments, where some people might say we historically can automate certain sectors and make those goods or those services very cheap. They don't then subsequently tend to grow to dominate the economy because they complementary with bottlenecked parts of the economy, and you kind of need to know about the price elasticities of demand, right? Often they actually shrink, right? Agriculture, for example, shrank as a fraction of the economy after it became extremely cheap to create more food. It sounds like that is not what's going on here. Partly because we're not worrying about being complementary with humans. The whole point is that
so there's a huge difference. I mean, so there's a couple of different effects going on, and so it's worth thinking through them. So one is that labor always bottlenecks you on the production side in the past.
Yeah.
So you could just produce a lot of hammers if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And the reason we don't do that is because for two different reasons. One is we don't have enough workers. It just isn't worth paying people to man the factories that would make the hammers. Another reason is that we just don't have a use for all the hammers. Like there's just like a limited amount of
run out of hands.
Exactly. You know, what are you going to use the hammers for? And so AI kind of solves both problems. On the supply side, well, you just have robots that you use. You don't need humans anymore. And then, well, what are you using all this electricity for? Well, you're using it for more robots. At some point, then this might seem a bit like a demented chain of regress where you're just trying to grow really fast. And so I think this then comes down to the question of like, why do you want to grow in the first place and what it's useful for? And so I think there it becomes a question of, is the, I guess, demand for electricity, is that like, or like the set of goods that can grow really fast here, which is like electricity, but also like metals, primary production, manufactured goods, basically of all stripes. Is demand for that enough to justify investing heavily? And I think that is a complicated question to answer. It comes back to the savings rate question. Like, what are you saving for? In the agricultural case, there's just only so much food you could eat. And it like, does saturate like pretty hard. So in this case, like it's pretty clear one of the reasons that agriculture became a small sector is like, for $30, I can like basically eat like a king. I can't.
You're going to buy roughly the same amount of food no matter how
exactly
it costs, and it costs much less. Therefore, agricultural sector
exactly,
declines.
And that's even with like massive quality improvements. Like the food I eat today is much better than the food that people ate 500 years ago. There's just limited amounts, and so you could ask this question about electricity: like, is there just like at some point we just don't want to consume any more power? And it's complicated. I think we definitely do see demand for like 10 or 30x physical production or something. If you just look at how much a say wealthy American, like a 90th percentile American consumes versus like the average person. So I think if there aren't distributional issues, like if we do in fact manage to distribute the wealth among the human population, there's definitely scope for like a 10 or 30xing of the, well, maybe not 30, but at least like 10xing for sure, just based like very conservatively on like getting the average sub-Saharan African person in India and whatever to have the material life that a wealthy person does.
Yeah, maybe I want to press on that actually. I guess this is a thought experiment currently, which is just kind of what does max growth rate world look like? What does a fastest transition to that world look like? You might think, well, that's interesting, but I don't expect that we'll be in such a world because we're not going to have a central planner of the world. Economic activity is driven by economic actors who are like both producers and consumers. And then even in very rich countries, many people might just say, like, what the hell am I going to do with anything more than like a 2x larger economy, right? And then even if we brought everyone in the world up to comfortable, modern living standards in developed countries, that's not like a sustained doubling rate of like one doubling per year, right? That's just like a one-off level effect.
Yeah.
And so like, where does this come from? Is this like
a few different things? So first of all, the economic growth will only be fast for a very short period of time because these really doublings. Like, I think humans probably consume somewhere like a 0.1% of the sun's energy, if I remember correctly. Instant on Earth. So like, if you're like an Earth-based economy, well, we're never going to get more than like 10 doublings or something. So that's very important to keep in mind. It is necessarily transient because you definitely will run out of like space on the planet, if nothing else. But you're right, this is still quite far from present day. So the question is like why people would save. I mean, it's basically a few different things going on. One is that there may just be some people who do want a lot of stuff. Like this, the thing is like extremely cheap to build giant mansions and like, I don't know, like, would I want to build a giant mansion that's a replica of like Hadrian's from 180 AD or whatever? Like, I mean, today it's obviously not expensive. Like, it's too expensive, but like, if you have enough robots or something, like, hell yeah, like, of course, like, why not? And like, if you look at, for instance, how many like human servants, for instance, wealthy people could have in the past. I mean, it's obviously today, no one's really rich enough that they can have thousands of servants. But like, if you can have thousands of servants making your manicured lawn, that's achievable. It'd be like an absurd use of resources today, but like,
you're right. But you might think, look, I can, as an individual consumer, I can save to get my thousands of servants a year from now or more, and that would be kind of cool. But I don't really like. I've got a washing machine and stuff, right? So what I want to do is just consume.
It's so cheap. So again, this comes down to your model of savings. The classic economic model is like you can have a log utility function. And if you have a log utility function in exponential growth, you find that like actually the model breaks and you don't really care when you produce or consume because basically every waiting a bit longer means that it has grown a bunch, but growing a bunch on a logarithmic scale is additive. So you basically want to actually save forever on a logarithmic return, which is counterintuitive, but this shows you that even with fairly weak preference for more stuff, you actually want to save for a long time, and that's because exponential growth is really powerful.
Yeah, so it's totally compatible, to be clear, with everyone having diminishing returns,
exactly,
steeply diminishing returns,
even steeply diminishing returns. Yeah, it's very compatible to end up with being happy to save a lot, because exponential growth means you get exponentially more stuff.
Yeah, and I guess this goes back to the point that you mentioned earlier, which is it's analytically useful to talk about what would a central planner do. The point is not that we're likely to get some central planner.
Although that being said, you could imagine individuals or small groups who there are definitely some people alive today who want to produce all this stuff, and companies that want to produce all this stuff. And so you could actually imagine that there are just groups or organizations that are just trying to produce a lot of robots or things like this, and they may end up in some ways actually approximating this.
Phil Trammell made this point to me a while ago, which is there's heterogeneity among actors within a country or even among countries in the savings rate. So how much are you reinvesting and just going after long run growth? At least in the limit, the fastest growing actors just take up.
Win, yeah. The patient win the universe.
Yeah, exactly. A kind of boundingly large share of the economy, and maybe that happens again surprisingly quickly given fast growth rates.
Another thing with the central planning is just this is actually there is a large literature in macroeconomics of people exploring under what circumstances different kinds of individuals acting approximates a central planner, and so there are various theorems that show that if you imagine you have various rational individual actors, they can be approximated by a single rational individual actor. So this is a very standard way to analyze these kind of economic problems.
Yeah, I guess that is some part of the background that's worth saying out loud. Is economies do, with a bunch of rounding errors and details, do often somewhat well approximate just what would a planner do.
And if you want to imagine including savings rates or things like this, you can imagine what a planner would do if they were wanting to consume some stuff, for instance.
Sure.
So the framework is quite flexible.
Yep. Yeah, so I guess we're talking about transitioning from the world today, assuming we get enough AI progress to automate human labor, enough robotics progress to do that on the physical side. Going from today to this kind of very fast growth rate economy. One way that you might try to leapfrog ahead is basically cannibalizing the capital we have today. We already have a bunch of factories that might be doing stuff that's not optimal on this kind of the fastest path. How much of a speed up does that get you?
I think it's not huge in this setup. So if you are imagining that we're still using today's production methods and things like this, the difficulty is just that, so the things that are already producing useful things, you just want to have them produce useful things. And the things that aren't, they're just not that capitally that valuable. So specifically, if you want to produce a bunch of robots or things like this, it could be that you specifically want to cannibalize machinery that already exists in car plants or various industrial robot manufacturing or whatever. But that would be a relatively small fraction of the resources you'd have, basically. My overall sense is you probably wouldn't do a huge amount of cannibalization. Another question is how much consumption are you providing today? Because most of the things that are produced in an economy today are consumed. And while by just throwing more labor at factories, you can produce quite a bit more, there's actually quite a bit of slack in the system already. Factories do not produce at maximum capacity. And they could produce a lot more if they had the demand and there was labor. But even once you include that kind of extra capacity from people working overtime, the robots, I guess, working overtime, you still just do need to consume a bunch of things. So assuming that you want to keep, people fed and their living standards not go down crazily, you do just need to keep a bunch of things active because people still want shampoo and other products.
That's the main one, yeah.
Yeah, obviously if you imagined a malicious AI or a misaligned AI that was controlling an economy, it could get very grim quite quickly for the people who are no longer necessary.
Yep.
And then maybe they would start, cannibalizing various consumer product goods for this.
Yep.
On the other hand, they're still just not that useful. A canning facility just isn't that helpful for you if you're trying to make robots, for instance. You just probably would not get that much value from scrapping it.
Yeah. I guess incidentally, it is worth saying that maintaining current rates of consumption, that is, everyone just stays roughly as wealthy as they are, gets to consume roughly as much as we do today, that would be presumably not much of a haircut at all on the speed of their transition, because it would be a very wealthy world in the future.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think basically it reduces somewhat the amount of stuff you have to start with. Because if you imagine like the pool of stuff you have to reinvest, like, now you have to devote a bunch of it to current consumption. And the reason this isn't as big a deal as you might imagine is partly because like you can pretty quickly, like, because your stuff is growing more rapidly, you can like pretty quickly shift stuff back to consumption. And also because you can produce, there's already a bunch of slack in the world today, so you can in fact produce quite a bit more than you can currently with current material. So you already kind of start with like boost. It basically then shifts all the curves over. So it's like you end up doubling at the same rate at the end because consumption becomes like a meaningless fraction of the economy. But like maybe things are delayed by like 3 or 6 months or something because you know, at this beginning, you basically couldn't invest as much to begin with.
Yeah. I guess I'm almost asking the same question in different terms here, but in the fast-growing world, it grows fast because, fleets of robots are producing the next batch of, essentially robot factories and power generation capacity and so on. To get to that point, we don't have those robots yet. Compared to the amount of human labor, the amount of humanoid robots we have is kind of effectively zero. Could it not be the case that that kind of transition of just like bootstrapping yourself into the autonomous manufacturing regime takes many years?
It would take some time. It's not obvious it would take more than like 6 months or a year or two. So I mean, if you look at cars, we make 10. I need to get the exact numbers out, but I think we make like 100 million cars a year or something. Like we make a lot of cars. And if you look at the total number of robots you need to automate the economy, it's just not that many because you only need to automate the manufacturing sectors that make more stuff. Most humans, especially in an advanced economy like the US, just don't work in manufacturing. And furthermore, a single robot could replace many workers, even if we ignore like the obvious efficiency gains you would have if you were using robots. A single person only spends 2,000 hours a year working. So a single robot, if it can last a year, will be able to replace 4x as many people, basically. I find that it only takes on the order of like 10-ish million or maybe 10 million robots or something to like really be automating, and maybe even fewer actually, to really automate all of the manufacturing sectors.
Interesting. Okay.
Again, manufacturing is not that large a fraction of the economy. You don't need that many people. It may even be closer to 3 million. So the thing
in the
is,
US or in the world?
In the US.
Yeah.
These are all very crude estimates, but because manufacturing is not that large a sector of the US economy, and because one robot could replace multiple people, and also importantly, like a lot of labor is just not manual labor. If you don't need manual labor, then you just replace it with chips.
Yeah, sure. You don't actually need a human on a robot to be like typing into a keyboard for knowledge work.
So you just don't need that many robots to do most of the tasks. And compared to the number of cars we produce per year, it's just like really not that big. Now you still actually need to make the factories that make the robots or whatever. Like there is like some lag here. And there's a question of like, I guess, learning how to make the robots. And this assumption, we're kind of assuming that you kind of have the mature like production facilities or whatever. So like you could imagine lags, especially if you have to do R&D effort to design the robots. But once that's sorted, we make new cars and things like this pretty frequently. Like it's just, there's just not industrially, it's not that hard a thing to do. Like it takes months or years to build something, but like you would do it and then you would have the robots, and pretty soon you'd no longer be bottlenecked by the robots.
Yeah, great. So zooming out a bit, we're talking about this kind of max growth world with some assumptions. So labor is automatable and cheap, but other ways not inventing new technologies to speed up growth. There was this kind of separate thing that you mentioned, which is we are, not kind of meddling with the input-output tables in some sense. So, if part of a factory's kind of inputs are like catering, that's going to stay fixed. You do eventually address what happens if we relax that constraint and imagine reconfiguring the kind of recipes for production. I don't really know what a recipe means in this context.
So recipe is just the term that people use in input-output analysis for basically the set of stuff that goes in to make like a good. So for a car, like the recipe will be like the however many kilograms of steel, the dollar value of the steel that goes in, and the dollar value of the rubber and the electronics and so forth. And so that's like a recipe. It's like you literally take, it's like basically like a chemical formula. You take like X, Y, Z amounts of stuff, you put it in, and out comes a single car. I know this is like, it's like a linear thing. Every car needs a certain amount of steel. There's no variation here. It's not like you could instead make the car with 20% more steel, but 10% less.
Right. The tables alone don't tell you about the trade-offs. So
exactly. it's all linear. It doesn't tell you about different trade-offs. You can obviously add different goods. You could add like different kinds of cars, but each car would have a single recipe.
Yep.
And this is a limit of just how input-output analysis works.
Yep. Yeah. What can we say then about the kind of speed up that you could get in growth rates from presumably what we would in fact do, what the world would in fact do, which is change the recipes to grow faster given these new kinds of automation?
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways you can approach this. You can kind of come up with the top-down approach where you like look through different kind of input-output tables, or you think about how to broadly modify the existing input-output tables and try and see how much faster things can go. And then you could bottom up. You could instead say, scrap these current input-output tables. Let's just like think from first principles how to do this. And so in part 3, I tackle the kind of top-down approach, and in part 4 and hopefully beyond, I start thinking about the bottom-up. In terms of the top-down, how would you modify the input-output tables to be more realistic? So one very simple thing you can do is you can just look through current recipes and you can ask which things in this recipe exist only because there are humans involved. So the catering example was one. Like, if you look, you do see small numbers of consumer goods that do enter into the recipe. Like, if you look, for instance, at all the sectors, like there are just some amount of kind of bleeding in of things like food production into the input output, into like the maximum growth rate. And if you look at why this is, you discover that's because there's these basically like bleeding in of various consumer goods or goods that are only required because of labor. So like another one is like various forms of air travel. I mean, some air travel is obviously transporting like goods, but some air travel is like executives, passengers, exactly. It's like the executives are flying on an airplane. Like, well, if you have robots, you like wouldn't do that.
Yeah. It's quite a fun image, but
yeah. Likewise, so car travel, passenger travel, various forms of insurance. A big one is just that there are these, offices exist. Yeah. Now, if you have your accountants as digital AI systems, they're not going to be needing offices. And so, like, I think the biggest speed up I found here was simply that you wouldn't build a bunch of the buildings you build today because you wouldn't need physical offices. But basically, in part 3, one of the analyses, I just kind of strip out all of these different kinds of physical goods and physical flow goods that you don't need anymore. And so that speeds things up a bit.
Okay. How much is a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I find it speeds things up about 20, 30% or something. It depends a bit on what your assumptions are about lags. Because basically, the faster the economy grows, the more expensive lags become. And so as you start modifying the input-output tables, you start worrying about, well, if it takes like 2 years to build a factory, that becomes very expensive, even if everything is cheap.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. I guess that's not the only way that you can make growth faster. So one is just presumably just management.
Yeah. So I mean, management would, so you'd remove things like HR and payroll and things like this, and like a lot of, you probably won't pay consultants to like tell you which workers to fire. There's like a lot of services. I mean, another set of things you don't need in this toy example is R&D. You don't need any research and development because it's all solved. Obviously, in reality, that you would be doing R&D, but like you do R&D in reality to make things grow even faster. So there's a bunch of services that...
To be clear, this is not like a crazy assumption because you're just limiting yourself to like existing technologies.
Yeah, I'm assuming existing technology is being scaled up.
Plus robots.
Yeah. The reason we do R&D is because we think we can do better with new technology. So obviously, in reality, we'd do R&D, but that would be because things would go even faster in the future. So yeah, so we can strip all those sectors out. That speeds things up a bit. Another change is that you just would want to be operating with more capital, so more labor-intensive methods, because essentially labor is cheap. You want to be using lots of labor.
Yeah.
So in the present day, we associate capital inefficient, like so labor-intense, like low capital production, we associate that with like developing countries.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they have fewer resources, they have generally an oversupply of people relative to capital. So this is seen as inefficient. But like if you're got the cheap robots, there's no point in replacing your cheap robots with bespoke equipment to automate processes. You're better off doing the opposite.
I find this really counterintuitive. Like in some sense, the process of industrialization and economic development just looks like
it's all a mistake.
Yeah, right. You're barking up the wrong tree. Yeah, it looks like making manufacturing less labor intensive because labor becomes more expensive and you have new technological means to automate parts of manufacturing. So, even if historically it would have been much more too expensive to like have a fancy machine to do something that a human could do, it becomes more economical to add more machines and have, fewer people per machine overlooking the factory floor, as it were. And then, I mean, it makes sense in some way, but it's kind of weird that like once you have full automation, you almost want to kind of revert back to highly labor intensive, what would currently be highly labor intensive means of production.
I agree. It's not that intuitive. And I mean, it's also important to note, it's not clear in the real world once we include like R&D progress and things like this, it'll end up looking like this. Or you could end up, I mean, in some sense, the thing that robots are is that they're cheap and general purpose. And the claim is that humans are also general purpose, but they're not very cheap. And so we've replaced them with specialized machinery. And so the question becomes, are you better off having a bunch of general purpose machinery that can do lots of stuff but isn't that specialized? You're better off having bespoke machinery that is maybe better to shop in some ways, but like it's less specialized. And I think it's not clear in practice how that trade-off works. So, I mean, you also imagine the robots themselves might become very diverse and very like specialized to different tasks. But in this specific analytic framework, where like let's just assume basically current methods, but you're replacing humans with robots, then the best method is to use the very human-intensive, not very capital-intensive approaches.
Yeah. So maybe this would kind of be more realistic in the kind of transitional period, and then in the long run, I can imagine there being arguments that actually the faster-growing economy is just a highly specialized economy.
It's actually less clear because, I mean, why do you specialize? Well, there's a bunch of different reasons. So, like, you might. But some of them are just due to like you want things to be more durable, to last longer. And that isn't something you care about when the economy grows really fast. When the economy grows really fast, you just want to make sure that things produce a lot initially, and you don't really care about things lasting a long time. And likewise, like, are you better or worse with processes that are more error prone? Well, it just depends on the trade-off, and the trade-offs will become quite different. So I think like it just is. More expensive capital is just more expensive to make. And so it just becomes a question of, is it worth it? And that just varies a lot depending on like what you're getting for your more expensive capital. It's a mistake to think necessarily that like the best approach is like a very highly engineered one.
Interesting. I guess I would have just thought intuitively, at least kind of in the long run, you want to produce the wing nuts for the next generation of factories, whatever. The wing nut factory would be wasting time and money if it were using general purpose robots, that can like walk around and they're like highly dexterous. For basically the same reason that today you just want like specialized wing nut manufacturing hardware.
Yeah, I think maybe. I mean, it's plausible for sure. As you do more R&D, you'd like want to specialize more. It's cut off because especially as the economy grows more and more rapidly, transportation costs become larger, coordination costs become larger. Like moving stuff just takes time. And so like I think it's a real question of like, for instance, and at growth rates of a year, this probably isn't that relevant. If you're looking more growth rates of like a few weeks or a month, just it really is really bad if you have to move stuff long distances. And so
yeah, there are other ways that you can get faster growth rates just by kind of reconfiguring existing recipes.
Well, the tricky question here is actually getting data on the existing recipes. Like the whole aim with the input-output analysis was like, people have all of these, beliefs about how the economy grows or whatever. And I'm like, I just want to have a framework and I want to have data where we could just like actually point to like hard data and hard disagreements or whatever that people can have. And so like the input-output table settles a lot of the like empirical questions of like how quickly can things produce. The annoying thing is there's limited input-output data available. The nice thing is the US economy does in fact have a bunch of input-output data available for various years in the past. And what was a more labor-intensive, less capital-intensive economy? Well, the US in like 1963 or whatever just did use a lot more human labor relative to the capital.
Yeah.
And so one analysis I do is I consider, imagine that basically it's like kind of like playing Victorio, but you now have a few different islands to play on. And at each island, you can only build the capital of the like, yeah. So you have the 1963 island where everything is like 1963 factories and stuff. And you've got the 2017 island where you build like the 2017 factories. Now, the difficulty with setting this up is that you can't assume that goods produced in 1963 are compatible with goods produced in 2017. They're like quality differences. So for some goods, it's pretty straightforward. If you know how much electricity is produced, you can roughly say like, okay, we can allow like cables going from the 1963 island to the 2017 island.
Electricity is electricity. It doesn't need to be like fine grade or whatever.
And then, maybe you enable like, aluminium to be shipped.
Sure.
But it becomes more and more difficult as you get more complicated goods. Like, computers built in 1963 are not quite dollar for dollar compatible with 2017 computers. So in any case, I divide different sectors and by levels of compatibility, and I try and hook them up and see what happens. And what I find is that you do in fact shift most of the recipes where that it is compatible between the sectors, you do in fact want to use historical recipes rather than present day ones, because it is more labor intensive. But it varies a bit, and it's not always that you want to use like the 1947 recipes or whatever. Like the optimal year does vary a bit.
I mean, I guess you do. I think you did say in the piece that like steel in particular, like if you could take a steel mill from like late 1940s or something, then you should like literally prefer that from a 2017 steel mill if you can replace all the humans with robots, because it was just so much more labor intensive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, in reality, the best approach probably isn't a 1947 steel mill or a 2017 steel mill, but it might be something that is using the best of both worlds. But yeah, it just like the current process of the last 100 years of replacing the cheap steel mill with the expensive one and fewer people just like is just goes into reverse.
Yeah. It's very scenario kind of steampunk in some way.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Nice. Yeah, is there a kind of headline number here when we take into account all the different efficiencies you can get from just reconfiguring?
Yeah, so when I try and to take a step back, so like when I was just using current recipes only, I was finding a doubling of every year roughly, along those lines. And with savings, it might drop to every 2 years. And now the question is, if we try and push the input-output tables to their limits, but we're still like remaining within the current input-output tables, I found the economy could double roughly every 4 to 8 months. So again, even with these like kind of different years or whatever, you're still quite limited by the current input-output table. So I think that you should really treat this as like more of a lower bound of how fast things could go with 100% saving rate. That caveat aside, rather than like how fast things would go. But it does seem like getting in the 4 to 8 month range is just like quite physically plausible with technologies that are known and have been used in the past. There doesn't really seem to be a strong barrier to achieving that kind of growth.
Yeah. I guess I will say as an aside here, it really feels worth emphasizing this observation that as long as you can automate human labor, you basically don't need any other kind of sci-fi feeling technologies to get these quite sci-fi feeling outcomes of extremely fast doubling times that like literally can't last more than a few years before you've just covered
like,
the earth
and stuff.
Yeah,
exactly. And it seems counterintuitive, but it really is just like if you look at industrial production, this is just like how it does in fact work. And they're just like our intuitions about how the economy works are just so grounded in assuming that you need humans to do stuff. But like, yeah, things can grow very rapidly. I mean, we saw this with like COVID, like exponential growth, it just is very powerful. When things can autonomously replicate for themselves, like it can get out of control pretty quickly.
Yeah. Like in some sense, a self-growing economy, given automation, is just there for free technologically.
Exactly. Yeah.
And therefore it's just much easier technologically than, like life extension or nanotech or any of these other things.
Yeah. And if your energy production doubles every year, you just like, I know, if everyone just decided to wait 10 years before they consumed, they suddenly have 1,000 times more energy. And so it's partly like, why would people want this? Or like, why wouldn't people just consume everything? It's like, well, if things are doubling every year, you just get absurdly much larger amounts of stuff. And just like basically one interpretation is that, yeah, all of the physical stuff is becoming essentially free to everyone.
So we were talking about how much gains do you get from just reconfiguring existing technologies to better suit a world of full automation. Possibly you can do even better than that through this kind of bottom-up method that you mentioned, which is just forget the input-output tables, forget existing production methods. Suppose you were just designing technologically the means to grow as fast as possible.
Yeah.
That begins to look like asking what are the physical limits. So yeah, how do you start answering that question?
Well, it's a difficult one because I mean, you have to look at what physically binds. I mean, in some ways, there's a few different approaches you can still take. You can think of this as basically making synthetic input-output tables, like thinking about what the different ways you would produce things are if you are trying to grow very fast. And this is what I am thinking about in part 4, which will hopefully be out by the time this podcast comes out. So the question becomes like, what actually bottlenecks growth and what can we say about the bottlenecking sector? And so in part 4, I focused on energy production. If we look at the input-output tables as they currently exist, energy does seem to be the most bottlenecking of the sector, so it's like a natural place to look. It's also special as basically an unsubstitutable good. Like you need energy to produce things. You can look at other sectors, like, how easily we could mine iron or make hammers or things like this. But like, how do you know that you wouldn't just, substitute? Yeah, well, I mean, like, you could just, try and substitute aluminium or titanium or something like this. So, you always have this question: do we really need these goods? Do we really need hammers? Can't we just use mallets instead? So, like, this isn't true with energy production. It's you definitely need energy to do things. Another thing that's very useful about energy is, like, not only do you need some energy to do stuff, like, you can quantify how much energy you need to build things. So there's this notion of embodied energy. This is common in environmental analysis, where you want to know how much energy, how much CO2 was used to produce a good. But we can similarly look at the embodied energies of goods for this purpose of, like, asking how quickly can the economy grow. Our aims are a bit different to the environmental economists, so there are some adjustments that must be made, but the basic idea holds. So what we want to do is this: we want to ask, what does a minimal kind of electrical production and distribution system look like that takes as little energy as possible to produce itself? So, you might imagine a system might look like you have a solar panel, you'll have some wires, you'll have a transformer, some cables connecting it to a factory, and the idea is, okay, just imagine that everything is free but the electricity. So the only thing that costs you is the amount of power you need. If the solar panel has a megajoule worth of energy in order to produce it, and it gives you a watt of energy, then that would mean it would take 10 to the 6 seconds for it to make enough electricity to make a new copy of itself. And so if you think about an economy that was relying on these solar panels to make electricity, then no matter how fast everything else was going, it just cannot make the solar panels faster than this.
Right, this is a kind of speed limit on everything else.
Exactly.
Yeah, and to say some of that back, the idea is you have some amount of solar panels, or they generate power at some rate measured in watts. And how quickly could they possibly produce just the same amount of power generation capacity? Well, this is going to be limited at least by how much energy do you really need to presumably, mine, extract, separate the materials required to build solar panels and then assemble them.
Yeah.
And this is, even kind of putting aside the cost of assembly, there's just these kind of physical, chemical limits. And then that can give you a kind of doubling time speed limit on just how much can we increase energy generation capacity over time.
Exactly. So we need to basically do two things. We need to, like, design or kind of try and understand what a minimal system would look like and why that is the minimal system. And then we need to estimate, okay, like, how much energy is in this minimal system. The easier part is really estimating for a given, like, material or a given thing, like, how much energy does that cost? So saying, this is a topic that environmental engineers and economists do study because it's quite important if you want to minimize carbon production. And it also is closely related to just fundamental thermodynamics. So there's this thing called the Gibbs free energy, which tells you at constant temperature and pressure, like, how much energy do you need to make a good? It's a fundamental limit. It follows directly from the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot make something more cheaply than the Gibbs free energy.
Is the idea that, like, if you have kind of component materials, there's just a minimum energy required to create some, like, composite material? What's the...
Yeah, so essentially it comes down to two things. So it takes a certain amount of energy to put things together, and then thermodynamics, heat is work and so forth. So there's a question of, like, how you can trade off. And you can't, by the second law, you have to expel a certain amount of entropy. So the Gibbs free energy is telling you, like, what's the minimum amount of energy you can do without... I'm gobbling this horribly. It comes through a consequence.
No listeners will know.
Yeah, it is a consequence of the first and second law of thermodynamics. Energy is conserved. You can't pull out of nowhere. Now, we actually live in a world where we're constantly surrounded by energy in the form of heat, but you can't use that for useful work because of the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy. So basically, Gibbs free energy tells you how much energy you need once you take into account this fact that you can't reduce entropy. And it's a hard limit on production. You cannot do better than this.
I guess with a lot of these hard limits, I think about the Landauer limit for computation. They don't seem especially practically relevant because we're so far off them, and so I'd expect other things to bind much earlier. Is it the case with this Gibbs free energy?
No,
thing?
we're actually pretty efficient with Gibbs free energy. So if you look, for instance, at steel or aluminium or concrete production, and you ask how much energy does it take to make from the available goods in the world, we're within a factor of 2 of this, which is pretty good. I mean, it's been a lot of engineering effort to do so, but like we are quite efficient, and I think this is probably also pretty close to like what is physically attainable, because the Gibbs free energy itself is the limit that you can do, but to actually attain this requires you to be acting at thermal equilibrium. It would take infinite long time. You'd need like an infinitely large vessel. There's all sorts of complications. And also when we're thinking more with an engineering hat rather than a physics hat, like it's uneconomical to have a process that's 1% more efficient, but will take you 100 times longer. Like you actually need the goods like fast.
Yeah. And sorry, just to ask the same question again, this measure of efficiency, is this kind of given the like inputs to, let's say, aluminium production, we're close to within an order of magnitude of the limits to kind of turn the inputs into aluminium at the other end?
Yeah, so basically the Gibbs free energy tells you it's an energy required to do a transformation of matter. So in the everyday world, we find aluminium as aluminium oxide, so like it's bauxite. So when you want to make aluminium metal, you're doing a chemical reaction, basically. You're doing a chemical process in order to what's called reduce the aluminium from the oxidized state that's found in nature to the metal that we know and love. And that requires a certain amount of energy given by the Gibbs free energy. And likewise with iron, it's found as various kinds of iron ore. In this form, the iron, again, is oxidized, so it is surrounded by oxygen molecules. We want to get rid of those to make reduced iron. And again, there's just a certain amount of energy you need to do that, and you just can't get away with less energy than that. There's no way to do that process physically. And we are pretty efficient if you look at it.
Right, at turning heaps of ore into the reduced
reduced metal. Yeah.
Great.
Now, other products they vary a bit. Like if you look, for instance, titanium is quite a bit harder to make. But even if you look in detail, okay, why is titanium more expensive? You start look at the reasons and the industrial effort we put in, it becomes
these are pretty well optimized.
Yeah, it is very well optimized.
Yeah.
Many people have tried to like improve upon the existing processes. They're reasonably close to the physical limits. When you look at why there's inefficiencies and waste, it's quite hard to remove.
Yeah. Okay. So these are going to be, it sounds like, actually maybe reasonably informative speed limits.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you kind of find when you try to crunch the numbers on this minimal energy production, payback time kind of question?
Maybe to take a step back first.
Sure.
So this is for if you want like a kilogram of iron, it's pretty easy to calculate roughly how much energy you would. And because we're both pretty close to the limits, we know how engineering, like how you actually get close to the limits. I think we can be pretty certain that getting that kilogram of iron will require a certain amount of energy. The thing that is tricky to estimate is like how much material do you actually need to make something? Because, your ideal solar panel system and electrical grid is going to use as few materials as possible. So for a solar panel itself, the area the solar panel needs to cover is fixed by like how much energy you can capture by the sun. You can't, make more than the energy that the sun irradiates onto the surface. But if you want to make it really thin, then you can reduce the energy a lot. So the question for the solar panel becomes like, what's the minimal thinness you can make this material, like this solar panel? Obviously, also, you can choose materials themselves that have less energy required to produce. But the energy required to produce materials, it varies obviously from material to material, but it doesn't vary that much because it's mostly set by how much energy you need to rearrange the physical bonds. So the chemical bonds typically are on the same order of magnitude energy requirements, and therefore, like if you look at materials, the embodied energy is, to first approximation, roughly just like the mass of the thing. So what we want to do is we want to create really thin solar panels. We want to create wires that require very little equipment. We don't want to be like, basically we want to be like stripping everything down to fairly cheap and light materials.
Do you know how close to the kind of, thinnest theoretical solar panels we can get are just present day solar panels?
So actually quite thick. So silicon solar panels, I'm trying to remember correctly, but I think they're on the order of a few millimeters thick, if I remember correctly. I could double check.
I mean, I guess there's also just the weatherproofing and just extraneous stuff.
Well, there's a few different things going on. So for a start, I mean, if you look at solar panels, they just have a thick layer. I mean, it's probably not that thick, but like they have a layer of glass.
Yeah.
And that glass itself is just like, it takes an amount of energy to make glass. So that glass will just be like, take days for the solar panel to produce in and of itself. They're made of silicon, and actually silicon is not a very is not very intrinsically not very efficient at turning photons into electricity, in that it doesn't absorb the sunlight very well. What you want is like a photon to hit it and create an electron hole pair or whatever that generates electricity. And it just turns out the way that silicon works, you need like an additional vibration basically to occur, like an additional photon. So like, for theoretical reasons, is not a very efficient absorber. You can think of basically the ideal solar panel as like a tiny thin black sheet that all of the light hitting is like absorbed.
Yeah. But presumably, like basically all solar PV is silicon based.
Well, at the moment, it's silicon based, and that's because despite silicon's inefficiency at absorbing, at the present day, we're not trying to make really energy cheap panels. I mean, what's the cost of a panel? Well, energy is one cost. Like it is like a reasonable cost of materials is in fact the energy in it. But there's also like how much physical capital you need to produce it. There's a question of like how easily can you transport and move it around. So you want a panel that's not going to break. And then when we're talking about present day capital, it's, we want something that will last 25, 30 years. So we want to put this layer of glass because maybe that layer of glass might cost like 30 days worth of of energy production. Like that, for our really rapid production, that's like a terrible idea. But like if you want your panel to last 30 years, well, you need to make sure it doesn't break against hailstorms. And like what's 30 days in like 30 years? It's like nothing. So in the present day, we optimize these to be really cheap on present day inputs, but that is quite different to being cheap in terms of the embodied energy cost.
Yeah, I guess there's a general point here, which is if you're optimizing for growth rates and the growth rates are fast, that is on the order of doubling per year or even faster, then you want to be making a bunch of goods which are just like not durable at all and just break very quickly.
So the way that it works is basically like the growth rate you have is basically like the interest rate in economics. So the interest rate tells you how much you should value something in the future versus today. So like if the interest rate is 5%, then like $1 today is worth $1.05 in a year's time.
Yep.
$1 a year back is worth like 95 cents or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
And when we think about present day engineering, interest rates typically around like real interest rates are typically around 5% once you exclude inflation. So like when we're optimizing, why do we want solar panels to last about like 20, 30 years? Well, like with the 5% interest rate, it means that the panel's value in 20 years time is roughly like 30% its value today. So you still care quite a bit about that. Like, spending 10% more to make it last an extra 10 years from 20 to 30 years. It's like a good trade-off, right? Like you should do that.
I think it's a question about what happens to energy prices when you're considering your payback times on solar panels, but point taken basically.
So basically, yeah. So when you have a very rapidly growing economy, the growth rate, the interest rate you want to use is the growth rate itself. So if your growth rate is doubling every year, then a solar panel in a year's time is worth half as much as a solar panel today. One in 2 years' time is worth a quarter as much. 3 years' time is worth an eighth as much. So basically, like very quickly, you end up not caring at all.
Yeah. It's very interesting because it looks kind of wasteful from one perspective, but this is the solution if you are maximally farsighted and you're reinvesting.
Yeah.
You don't care about consumption. You don't have like a pure rate of time discounting. You still want to have these like highly non-durable outputs.
Exactly. It's just more efficient. And it's again, it's the nature of exponential growth. It's like, it seems weird to us to make something that only lasts 6 months, throw it away. But the economy is so much larger in 5 or 10 years if it's doubling every 6 months that you should just definitely rather make things slightly faster and just build more because it's so cheap to build things in the future. And in fact, if you look in nature, which has a bunch of replicating systems that replicate quite fast, it's actually like pretty common to see this kind of trade-off occurring where organisms just replicate more cheaply. And it may seem inefficient, but in fact, this is the fastest growth is actually producing, for instance, like a lot of crappy copies of something, most of which don't work, rather than things that will last a really long time. It's just better to be cheap and to produce more quickly.
Yeah, it's a good point that the fastest growing biological organisms, well, first of all, they tend to be smaller.
Yeah, they need to be smaller because of diffusion limits.
Right. And then also, I hadn't fully considered this, but presumably they have much shorter lifetimes in some sense.
Lifetime is a bit difficult
I guess it's kind of
define
trivial
for bacteria because they can like live very long times in the right.
Right. But I guess among mammals, I would imagine this is true.
Yeah, I think there's scaling laws people derive, or like people like empirically plot. So yeah, definitely longer lived things are bigger and vice versa, as an average, as a general rule.
Yep.
But yeah, so like if you're if you have fast growth rates, you just want to be making things really cheap. And so the question is, what does a solar panel look like when you want to be really cheap? And well, you would basically try and make it as thin as possible. And so what limits your thinness? Well, there's a few different things. One is that you need an absorbing layer that absorbs sunlight. And there are physical limits on how good your material can be at absorbing sunlight. Like a single atom layer is just not going to absorb most of the sunlight that comes in. But there are materials that do absorb pretty well within a micrometer, basically. So there are perovskites. These aren't commercially scaled up yet, but they like physically exist. They're physically manufacturable. They're not like insane to produce. I think if we saw, multiple decades of like engineering effort to make these like cheap and produced at mass scale, like we would succeed. Like I don't think there's any hard barrier towards creating these kinds of materials.
What are they made of?
So I'd have to remember, but they're a mixture of different metals. Anyway, there are various materials that do in fact absorb quite efficiently at micrometer scale. So you definitely, the active layer itself, you can get to be very thin. And if you look at the payback times there, you find that like a solar panel could reproduce itself on the order of minutes. Now, that is obviously very, very fast. It might seem totally insane, but like cyanobacteria do in fact reproduce themselves in the order of a few hours under ideal conditions. So it's not totally insane to have something capture energy and use it to produce itself. Now, cyanobacteria are also about a micrometer thick. They're like very small. So like the reason that they're so good at this is in part because they are very, capital light, as it were.
Yeah. Is it maybe worth lingering on this? You mentioned, that's because of diffusion, that smaller organisms reproduce faster. You want to say more about what that means?
Yeah, so there's this thing called the diffusion limit. So if you imagine you have a perfectly absorbing sphere, there is a maximum amount of stuff that can be absorbed by that sphere for a given concentration. That depends basically on how fast the thing that's being absorbed is diffusing. So if you like think about a bit of smoke in a room, for instance, it'll spread out over time slowly. And in a room like the smoke is usually moving because of the air currents, but even if the air were perfectly still, you'd still, because of the molecular motions, you'd still see that the smoke particles would be bouncing around and they would like slowly over time move. So if you have a perfectly absorbing sphere, the bits of air immediately around that sphere, they're perfectly absorbing. So the little bit just above the sphere is going to have like no smoke in it because like all the smoke particles that would have been there have already hit the sphere.
Right.
And so because of this, you are limited in how much you can absorb. And it turns out that the absorption rate is proportional to the size of the object. So if you double the size of the object, you double the absorption rate.
Okay. Is this a kind of surface area to volume thing?
Kinda. It's spiritually the same, but the actual math ends up being linear. So if you imagine it was a surface area thing, you'd imagine it'd be r squared. But it turns out the way the diffusion works, because basically things are bumping around, and once they've hit you once, they can't hit you again. Because of that fact, you actually lose the surface area and you end up going just to the radius. So if it was a surface area thing, you'd imagine it goes as r squared. But just the way the math works, it actually ends up going linearly in r.
Okay. And why does this matter? So why is it useful to have higher diffusion rates?
Well, you can't control the diffusion rate. The diffusion rate is just like how the molecule is moving in the medium. Or at least like, for a living organism, it's like, in the ocean. It's just surrounded by these nutrients just bouncing around and just trying to capture them as much as it can. The amount of stuff you need to build your cell will generally go as the volume, right? Like you need a certain amount of nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever. Your volume goes as r cubed. Your diffusion, the amount you get goes as r, and therefore your growth rate would go as 1 over r squared. So you get punished by being bigger. And if you look, lo and behold, for instance, like the nutrient limited parts of the ocean, like the things that survive are really small. Like the smallest organisms we know are often, some of the smallest organisms we know, the smallest free living organisms, exist in these parts of the ocean, and they're tiny because there's so few nutrients around. They need to be basically as small as they can in order to need the fewest nutrients.
I see. So the idea is that you're an organism floating around the ocean and you're trying to kind of passively collect nutrients to grow, to get energy from.
Yeah.
You're asking, hey, should I like double in size?
It's like, don't double in size.
Yeah, exactly. So you're, atexing your volume and your mass, roughly speaking, and then you're getting kind of per mass much less, just like of the nutrients.
Exactly, yeah. You double the amount of nutrients you get in, but you get 8 times as many. You need 8 times as much to grow. So it's like it's a bad trade-off.
Okay.
Bad trade-off.
Yeah. I mean, this may be a bit of a tangent, but I'm kind of confused about some kind of tension here where the way that nature grows fastest is by being very small. And then the way that if you're a planner of an economy, you grow the economy fastest is like, you actually want a large economy. You want lots of like specialization. You want lots of like large machinery because that's often much more efficient at building stuff than tiny modular machines. It kind of feels like both can't be right in some sense. And maybe like in the limit, if you want to just grow the physical economy fast, everything gets extremely small for like roughly these diffusion reasons.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to ask why things are scaled the way they are. I think in a lot of cases being small is good. And this is like the logic, for instance, if you look at discussions of nanotechnology or like atomically precise manufacturing, you can there's a lot of room at the bottom. You can just like do a lot if you can shrink things and a lot faster. There are processes where you want to be really big. And in fact, diffusion is a reason why you might want to be really big. So if you want to collect stuff, you want to be small because you want things to diffuse too fast. Let's say you want to melt a huge ton of iron. Yeah. Well, one thing you don't want is you don't want the heat like leaking out. And so why the heat leaks out? Well, because it's again like heat diffusion. And so this is like your volume to surface area ratio. The bigger the volume to the surface area, the lower the diffusion of heat out. Yeah. So if you're trying to do this at a really small scale, I mean, one observation here is like animals, especially really small organisms, they operate at constant temperature. That you can't produce, like no bacterium can like produce like a hot region inside it. Like there is no equivalent to like heating up your iron or to like make molten iron.
The internal furnace, yeah.
Exactly. There's just impossible for a small organism to maintain this furnace.
I see. So I guess maybe the answer is why not both?
Given
that the economy is like designed and doesn't face the constraints of evolution, then there'll be many cases where you want very small stuff. Eventually, maybe you want nanotech if you care about max growth rates. There are also many cases where you can just exploit like very large volumes and large sizes.
So another example where size matters a lot is in like transport. And so like small things move slowly. Like they're limited to how much you can transport things. And so again, if you're asking like what size should things be? Well, there's a sense in which like the Boeing 747 or whatever is just like kind of the optimal plane. Like there's a reason it goes at the speed it does and at the size it does. And like it just, obviously depends what you're optimizing for, but like it is just much more expensive to go faster. It's very hard to be bigger. And these are just set by the aerodynamics and it just happens to be that size. You know what I mean? You see this with like living organisms. Like there are smallest...
Right, for a given niche. There's a reason why organisms are these size. Yeah.
Exactly. And there are just like limits, for instance, on how small flying things are. Like there's a limit at which organisms basically cannot fly.
Maybe worth asking about the limits to growth in biology. So you take the fastest growing organisms of a given kind, duckweed or bacteria with the right kind of nutrients and growth conditions. If you place very fast growing bacteria in a petri dish, it'll grow fast and then it'll stop. And, similarly, like the world is not covered in some kind of green goo of the fastest growing organism, right?
It's just like, to some extent.
I guess like watch this space. But, at least to date, what you get is just a bunch of like kind of reaching equilibria. You have this kind of different niches. Yeah, I mentioned what the main constraints to growth are in nature and then how many of those carry over to the industrial economy.
So there's a few different things going on. So like the fastest growing living organism it's Vibrio, same genus as cholera. And I think its doubling time is around 10 minutes. But this is under ideal conditions where you basically provide it all the energy. And so I think an important thing to remember with biological systems is they're not closed. They always are consuming things from the environment. And so it's a mistake to just say, well, because this thing can replicate very fast under this condition, like, oh, we could like definitely grow this fast. Sometimes I think people point to things like octopi or whatever. I mean, like, well, octopi replicate really fast, and therefore couldn't we make machines that replicate this fast? And the answer is, well, octopi eating other things.
Yeah.
If you don't have those things available, then you can't grow fast. Like an octopi on the moon will not grow at all.
Right.
It'll be a very
huge exclusive research insight from Damon Binder.
You read it here fast. Or had it here fast. So you have to think carefully about like what you mean by autonomous replication, like what the power source, energy source was the raw material is coming from. I mean, another way to put it is like we have things that replicate much faster than the fastest living organism. Like in a nuclear chain reaction replicates extremely fast, but it's hard to get economically useful or at least like scaled economically useful work out of it. I guess, in reality, if you can make something go really fast, you'll just get bottlenecked by whatever inputs into that process. The fastest growing free living organisms essentially isn't like totally free living. They're not relying on other organisms to like, most things are basically eating other things or consuming the waste products of other things. Like most bacteria in the environment are what are called heterotrophs. They're eating sugars and other carbon sources that have been released from plants and algae and primary producers. So, it's not necessarily the case that they can grow that fast. So they might be able to grow very fast if the nutrients are available, but most of the time they're not available because someone else has eaten them already. So the fastest, what are called autotrophs, things that basically produce their energy themselves, they're not reliant on the organisms, are cyanobacteria and algae that, for instance, live in the ocean or freshwater. And for these guys, well, they're not energy limited per se. Actually, if they were just limited by the photons, they'd end up being very similar to this like minimal solar panel that could reproduce in like seconds or maybe minutes. Instead, what they end up being limited by are inorganic nutrients that you need to grow, and you can't get any other way but by finding them in the environment. And so it turns out, in practice, nitrogen, phosphorus, iron are pretty common limiting ones. I think phosphorus probably the most limiting one on geological timescales, nitrogen the most limiting one on like kind of local timescales. And the only way you can get those is by diffusing and absorbing the nitrate or the phosphate or whatever in the ocean. And there's not much around because other organisms have also spent a lot of time trying to absorb all the nitrate. And so there's obviously these processes going on at various timescales that control nitrate and phosphate concentrations.
It's funny, I'm imagining if you're like trying to build a cyanobacteria civilization somehow, it actually would kind of face somewhat similar constraints to the kind of human-built physical industrial explosion in that you have bottlenecking, raw inputs, you're ultimately just collecting solar.
Well, I mean, I think in like the abstract sense, there's a lot of similarities, or like in some sense, like optimizing growth processes, but both in terms of the actual like physical and chemical processes, there's obviously a lot of similarities, and then like mathematically, you always end up getting bottlenecked by whatever is the slowest thing. And I think people often make this mistake when looking at evolutionary systems of kind of analyzing them in isolation or having the wrong notion of efficiency. For instance, like cyanobacteria are not necessarily that efficient photosynthetically. Like they don't necessarily, if you look at like what percentage of the energy that they absorb, the energy incident that they actually like absorb and turn into sugars or whatever, that's not that high. But they're not energy limited fundamentally. They're fundamentally limited by nitrogen and phosphate. So like making, using more nitrogen to make somewhat more sophisticated solar collection system would just be like a bad idea because it'd be trading something expensive, the nitrogen, for something cheap, the energy, right? If the sun's basically free, you don't need to capture all of it.
Yeah. I guess when we're thinking about the real breakneck physics speed limits on growth, then it's possible that lags start to look more important. That is the kind of like absolute time you have to wait before you can just like stand up the next batch of solar panels. Like, how big a deal is that?
So, I mean, it's annoying because it depends. I think basically it's like, there's usually two regimes. Either the lags dominate or the like energy costs dominate, or like they're roughly equal. That's probably not a very coherent explanation. Yeah. So it depends on how fast the growth rates are. So, I mean, I guess we got very sidetracked on the biology, but like, what does a minimal solar panel system look like? Well, maybe it's helpful to describe a bit. I think the limits are not per se physics in like the hard sense of like, you can't, if you look at like the hardest physical limits of just like, what's the bound on how much energy you can absorb and like how much energy you need to make that layer, it ends up being minutes. And like with cyanobacteria, you can see they can replicate in hours. So like the hardest physical limits are not that binding. But when we start looking at more practical engineering constraints, like we do need a system that lasts, at least months or something. Like if it breaks within, 12 hours, it's not good enough. We also need a system that can actually distribute energy to places, which is something that cyanobacteria don't do. Like you can't charge your battery using cyanobacteria. Like that just doesn't work. And if you start to think about what it would take to make cyanobacteria that could charge a battery, you quickly run into like, this doesn't really work. Cyanobacteria in the ocean, for instance, like they don't move. They are completely passive, and they also like they can't communicate with each other. They don't know where they are. Like they're very simple organisms, and it's not obvious that you could in fact use their really rapid growth to actually make an energy system that would in fact function on an industrial scale. Now, if you imagine like really crazy nanotech, like maybe this doesn't matter, or maybe you can do pretty crazy things very locally. But if we at least assume that we have something that vaguely looks like some industrial system, then I think what limits the solar panels themselves is just actually like being thick enough to like stay in place and not break. And so the kind of best analogy I think here is actually like gardening mulch, or the kind of thin plastic films that people use in fields. And so like those like could be like 10 or 50 micrometers thick. And so what your ideal solar panel might look like is basically like this really thin layer of active material, and then you just have plastic on either side, enough plastic to basically protect the thin layer from the atmosphere, from moisture, from UV radiation, and also so that like if there's wind or like as you roll it out, it'll like immediately break.
Sure. Yeah.
Which you notably can't do with cyanobacteria. You cannot roll out like your cyanobacteria into a thin layer, and then you obviously need some wiring so that you actually accumulate the electricity. And so I think if just those minimal panels look very much like garden mulch, and you'd like have a massive roll, you'd roll them out with like a tractor, and then you'd just basically use some steel pins to just like pin them down to the ground. You'd be like really not having any infrastructure whatsoever you can avoid. You'd not care if a bunch of them break. You'd just be really like just laying it out there. Probably it could reproduce like enough energy to produce itself in like a day or two. This kind of middle setup. Yeah. There's questions of exactly what it would look like once you start taking into account errors and things like this. But I think like definitely like within like a week or something. It doesn't seem to be like hard barriers. It would require some engineering effort and some ingenuity, but it's not hard limited or something.
But again, on the topic of lags, if we're talking about doubling times of roughly a day or even a week, then it seems to me like the thing that I start imagining being the bottleneck is just, okay, you have this like, solar panel sheets you're rolling out across fields, but you got to transport them, and you got to transport the kind of inputs of the factories. And there are all these little hard to compress lags, which maybe start to make up most of the doubling time.
I think it's worth discussing before the lags what the rest of the solar panel looks like. Because I think the thing with lags is like it's a question of are the lags the problem, or is it like the energy the problem? Like which is the bottleneck? Yeah. And so the solar panels themselves, a couple of days, like not that expensive, but you need a bunch of other stuff if you want to have electricity somewhere other than like the field or something. And again, like maybe you can imagine an economy where you like literally have tiny factories every like kilometer smelting aluminium or whatever. But like probably practically speaking, you want to transport your energy from the field to a central location. And to do that, you need wires, you need a certain amount of material in the wires. And in fact, I find that ends up probably being the most expensive bit of the whole thing. I estimated using sodium wires because it just turns out that seems to be the cheapest metal, although you could use aluminium for not that much more expensive, and it's a bit more practical because it doesn't melt. Whereas the sodium wires would be molten sodium, which has actually been done in the past. This is not like... Yeah, so there's I think a British company that made wires this way in the 60s and 70s, but like it's not that much more expensive just to use aluminium. But in any case, especially once you want to transport things over thousands of kilometers, you just end up finding the most expensive thing is just the literal physical wires. Like it's a lot of money to...
You mean to transport electricity?
Yeah.
Yep.
You need something that conducts very well, and basically if the thinner the wire, the more resistance there is. The more resistance there is, the more you lose to heat. So you just need to have a thick enough wire that you don't lose too much to resistance.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And so there are just like physical limits on how you can transport this energy. And so what you find is that ends up probably being the bottlenecking thing. Another component that's actually quite expensive is the battery. Now, maybe you don't need a battery. Maybe you just have your economy turn off, for 3/4 of, half the day or whatever when it's nighttime. But like assuming you want to run most of your other equipment most of the time, which usually seems desirable, you need batteries that can store the energy during the day and then release it at night. And this actually ends up being quite expensive. And there's kind of a logic here. So if you imagine like how do you store energy in a piece of matter? Well, you actually have to do some like rearrangement of the chemical bonds in that matter that's reversible. So basically you want to like do some chemical reaction during the day that takes energy in, and at night you want to like release that energy back out. And the question is, okay, so how much energy do you need to make this battery? Well, it depends on the materials and stuff, but basically all materials are made by doing chemical reactions. And so like it turns out those chemical reactions will have roughly similar energies. And so like a battery usually the amount of energy it can store in itself is much smaller than the amount of energy that requires to make the battery, because there's just like a lot more chemical reactions you have to do to make the battery, and then like it's only a single chemical reaction you're reversing basically in the battery itself. And it actually just means batteries are quite expensive. Like it takes many uses of a battery for it to be repaid.
Could you not make kind of crude batteries, just like lifting physical things with a generator that turns into a dynamo, or like water, carrying it up a hill and pushing it back down again?
Yeah, so your ultimate goal is to, once hearing this, you're like, oh, okay, well, if it takes a lot of energy to make the storage material, then it's always gonna be expensive, because like, so can I find a storage material that is dirt cheap? And like, what a dirt cheap storage material?
Literal dirt
that you lift up. That's one. Another cheap material is water. You could just like pump water up into a dam and then release it. Another thing you could do is just literally heat up some rock and extract the energy again at night. I've looked into these options. Generally, I found that they all basically have issues, or they just didn't end up being that much cheaper than. So the cheapest option I found when I was trying to like look through cheap options are in fact what are called iron air batteries. What makes these so cheap is that they use iron ore, or like oxidized iron, and air, and they basically remove the oxygen from the iron when they're charging, and then they add the oxygen back at night. And it's cheap because like you're just taking materials that are already very abundant, like air and iron ore. They're just already available on the planet. Whereas if you wanted to use like a lithium-ion battery, then the lithium-ion materials themselves are actually quite expensive to produce. And so like they're better batteries in terms of efficiency. You store more of the energy than you get out, and they're much lighter. So like, if you're trying to make like a self-driving car or whatever, an electric car or whatever, there's like good reasons we don't use iron air batteries. But if you wanted to do something at a grid scale, you want to store stuff and you want to be cheap, iron air batteries look like a pretty good option. Lead acid batteries are not that bad. They're a bit more expensive, obviously unpopular for other reasons. But,
I mean, again, just as an observation here, I do find it kind of funny that at the frontier of growth rates, the best options suddenly look like extremely crude in some sense. Like this is not like some kind of shiny, polished sci-fi vision. Like it's actually this kind of chaotic,
very grungy
20th century technology kind of vision.
Yeah, exactly. I think people's intuitions are quite flipped, because the issue is like, you want capital that makes capital. Well, what makes capital expensive? Well, if it's expensive, if it's expensive capital, then it's going to be slower to produce. So you want everything to be cheap, basically. So iron air batteries look pretty good on this metric of just like cheap storage material in. And you could ask, why can't we? What about other options like hydro? And the issue is just a fewfold. With hydro, you just need good sites to do it, and it's just like limited in how much you could scale up. So I think in cases where the geography works out, it could be a bit cheaper as a storage device. But once you start having to like actually make dams and things like this, there's just like a lot of energy you need to make all that concrete, and also it's slow, so it takes many months or whatever for the concrete to set, and those lags really kill you. Like you cannot have a process that lags that much, otherwise that will really just be the bottleneck. And likewise with like heating rocks heating rocks are just like, if you actually think about like what you need to in fact extract the energy, you need your turbines and things like this. It just like ends up being kind of expensive. Probably still a lot cheaper than like lithium ion batteries, but not obviously better than iron air batteries. Now, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's hard to know exactly if you engineered everything, like where it would come out, but it seems like kind of hard for it to be orders of magnitude better than your iron air batteries. Lifting heavy objects, is very storage inefficient. Basically, the amount of energy you store per unit mass is just very low.
I see.
In fact, there's a kind of simple way to see this, which is like, let's say you were trying to store energy density much greater than like the chemical bonds. Well, what would happen? Well, the thing would just like break, or like you'd start disrupting the actual chemical bonds themselves would break. So if you had your crane that was so big that it was like actually storing enough energy, like your crane, the strain on the crane would break the crane or whatever. Just because like, it's just like an energy density issue. Like your system would just have a higher risk of catastrophically breaking.
I guess another question, if I imagine like a power bank, which I guess would be like lithium ion, or maybe it's different these days. How high would I have to lift it into the air to have the same potential energy as it would just have fully charged?
Yeah, so
it's like insanely high.
It's really high. And in fact, again, there's in fact, think if I remember correctly, it's on the order of tens of kilometers or something. But in fact, like this logically is similar to the height of mountains. Like there's like physical, why are things so high? Well, one reason is like the structural integrity starts to break. Like once the pressure is enough that you in fact will start to break the bonds, then that'll limit like how high your mountain can be and things like this. So like there is in fact there's a logic to this whole.
Okay, nice, cool. So this is like storage is.
Yeah, so storage becomes
transmission.
yeah. So once you sum all of these together, and it depends a bit on like do you store or not, and like how far do you transmit. But I find, with 1,000 kilometers distance traveled and with your batteries, it's about 9 days in total for your energy system to produce enough energy to produce itself. This assumes no lag. So this is just like every process, like it needs the energy, but it doesn't need anything else. It's like, snap your fingers. Once you have the energy, the thing appears.
Yeah. And then what about adding in lags?
Yeah, so here I actually find that it's not that big a deal. And I think this is not super intuitive, but the thing is like what physically do you need to do in order to make the panels? And you can trace back every step along the way. And none of them take very much time in the limit. They take a long time now, but that's because at the moment we don't try and optimize things to be really fast. We can trace back something like where does the aluminium come from? And well, you need to mine the aluminium. But if you imagine like a single atom of aluminium and like what is the process it takes in order to end up, in your, the cabling for some of your equipment or whatever, there's quite a few steps, but none of them physically are that time consuming. There's no like reason they have to be fast. In practice today, things will sit in storage for a bunch of time or whatever. But like that's because
the way on a conveyor belt and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's in large part because we don't have any reason to move things fast. Like it doesn't, again, it's the interest rate question. Like piece of capital in 6 months' time is only a few percent cheaper than like, worse than one today. So like, would you rather optimize your process to be like somewhat faster or just like bite the interest rate? Well, it's probably not worth spending twice as much to get things like 5% faster. And that flips when you are in this like crazy growth land. Then you're like, well, what actually physically bottlenecks you to produce things? Well, heating and cooling things does take some time. So like, you can't instantaneously like turn the aluminum oxide into metal, but it takes on the order of hours rather than on the order of like weeks. Like you can just pretty quickly get your aluminium out. So if you just look purely at like what would the minimal time requirements be, well, you needed a couple, probably like a day or two to like turn the raw materials into their finished kind of ready to assemble products. And that's limited by like just like heating stuff up and grinding things and like various processes, all of which are quick on their own. And then, you'll have to actually get the material out into the field and need to assemble it. And that will take some time.
Yep.
And, you'll need to wait for it to become daytime if it's nighttime. So like, there's some lag because literally it just takes you time to like, for the sun to come up. But I think on average, I found it was like the average bit of energy is put into the system like a few days before it is used in the physical limit of everything going as fast as it can. There are some things that do take a bit longer. So for instance, refining copper would take more like a week or something. It's just like it happens to be a relatively slow process. But it's a very small fraction of the energy. And also even then, like a week is not that long. So these just don't end up making your process much slower. I think from 9 days, it would look more like 12 or 15 days or whatever, once you include these lags. Now there's an important catch here, which is the ideal setup is like you have all your factories like literally next to each other. You have like, the thing comes out and it's used immediately. And at the present, that's not how things work. You have to transport things. And so if you have some transportation time, or in fact you just have it sitting in queues or whatever, then like it can blow out pretty quickly. But even then, like let's say, every factory takes a few days of transport because you don't really transport things very quickly or whatever. If it takes you like 5-10 steps, you end up with 10, 20, 30 days. That lag is like, it's a reasonable lag, but even when I plug that in, it slows things down only to be more like 20 or 30 day doubling times. It slows things down a bit, but like a 30-day lag will never like blow out things to take 6 months.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Another critical thing here is that's like the materials, like why the materials aren't that lagging. Then you've got the final assembly, but we've designed a system that is like very easy to assemble. So like rolling out your solar panels, well, you just like, you have your tractor, you roll it out. Like it's just, it could be very fast. Like there's no reason that takes a long time. Assembling a steel tower for the transport, like, well, you probably would avoid or minimize your use of concrete, so you don't have to wait for the concrete to set. But you don't need to use concrete. You could just use heavy iron. Like there's obviously trade-offs involved or whatever, but like it doesn't take you that long to actually assemble a tower. And today, a lot of construction is slow just because we don't have reason to make it fast, and workers are expensive. People don't want to work at night. There's obviously lots of other things that slow things down, like regulatory and things like this. So like, there's very little economic incentive to make a structure very fast, but like, you can just build these structures within like a few days. Like, if you have enough robots and you just do it in parallel, there's very little serial time bottleneck here. And so this is why the lags just don't really make things that much slower.
Interesting. The current question is, if you are just, designing some system from the bottom up to grow energy generation as quickly as possible,
yeah,
under full automation, what does it look like? And then, according to you, the answer is, well, order of a month doubling time seem like pretty doable, and maybe a bunch faster than that. And again, this is without, nanotech or whatever. This is just like,
this is just like
that we
doing,
know is possible.
There's a few pieces that would require some R&D efforts, like getting the thin layer, but like most of this is not even like particularly crazy R&D. It's just like do the obvious things in order to remove the process of the flow.
Yeah. And then I kind of want to get back to this question of, why does this matter beyond being a kind of fun thought experiment? Maybe part of the answer is this turnpike theorem point you made, which is the rough idea that basically any kind of goal that you have for your economy that requires, a bunch more inputs, the fastest route to it will look like just generic max growth path. The generic max growth path is going to look a lot like just how do you double your energy as quickly as possible, because that's like a major bottleneck. And then moreover, it doesn't need to be the case that there is one planner randomly deciding to grow everything as fast as possible on Earth for this to happen. It seems kind of actually quite plausible that under full automation, even just with a big old variety of people's motivations and preferences, and with a bunch of consumption as well, still the future just does kind of resemble this max growth path. And so that's a reason to think that the kind of scenario that you're describing here, like just something roughly like it just might actually happen. And that's why it's kind of important. Is that roughly right?
I think roughly. I mean, I think there's a few things to note here. So at the moment, we're looking at like, okay, like if we try and, can we say something about like how fast things could go? And so there's both this question of like, can we rule out really, really crazy stuff? Like, can we rule out like minute, day, like the economy like triples every 3 seconds, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, it does seem like there's pretty hard physical engineering reasons, so forth. So what we know is we can double every like year or every 6 months or whatever. That from the input output tables, I think it's pretty clear that is like physically possible. That's separate from the the political questions of like, or the like, do people choose to do this? But like, it is definitely on the table. And so here we're asking the question, cool, can it go really a lot faster? Or is it a year both like the upper and lower bound? And so, because energy is both like such a central part of any production system, and also it is like pretty capital intense at the moment, we can try and ask, does energy, okay, cool, could energy be the bottleneck? And this analysis is showing, well, it does bottleneck you. If you thought growth could occur double every day or something, like like the energy production, I think is like pretty much, you can't do this unless your energy system is like somehow much like beating this kind of what we laid out. And like, there seems like a lot of things you can say about such a system, like it has to be quite small. You can't be transporting things long distance. Yeah, it looks very tough to see how this would work. I think it's not necessarily physically impossible, or I think there's like, there are definitely other considerations, but it definitely would look nothing like the current production. On the other hand, if you're looking at like a month's doubling time, it does seem like the energy production could keep up with that. Also, interestingly, means if you imagine that actually there's some other bottleneck that it's carrying, and it's like, we actually really can't grow faster than every 8 months, then like the energy itself would be pretty cheap in that case, because we've already seen the energy itself is not that expensive. So like something else would have to be like really the main thing that was difficult to produce. It's a little tricky to interpret, because the question becomes, is there another bottleneck? If there's no other bottleneck, then this would imply growth rates of about a month, which is, or maybe even a bit faster, which is very fast, right? Like,
yep.
The difference between doubling every year and doubling every month, they both sound very fast, but like if you double every month, then within a year you've just like completely blown out. Yeah, basically like what is feasible to produce on the planet, whereas you'd have a decade to do that in the year doubling time.
Yep, loads of time.
Yeah, it's 10 years. It's heaps of time.
I guess I want to get more of your all things considered takes now, say that we get full automation. So you can replace a human brain with an H100, and you can replace everything a human can do physically with a robot that costs like roughly a car or whatever. Yeah, what stands out as the most plausible seeming reason to you that we wouldn't get growth rates of roughly doubling per year or faster?
It's kind of tricky. I mean, I guess you could imagine a lot of international coordination to avoid this. It's tough because like you'd have to have basically everyone kind of agree. So one image is you should imagine like a strong international agreement that we won't train more powerful systems, and this kind of falling out as like a corollary of that. I mean, one reason you want a lot of energy is because you want a lot of compute, and you want a lot of compute because like compute kind of, I mean, in the future you can do a lot with the compute. You could have all sorts of digital minds or things like this, or you could just like whatever. Compute can be quite valuable. And so, like, if you have some sort of moratorium, if you have some sort of like binding agreement to not produce tons of compute, that would kind of like flow on to like maybe not producing a bunch of energy and things like this. Also, because it would be harder to enforce these kind of things if people were producing like crazy amounts of other stuff in the world. If you can produce crazy amounts of robots or things, then like you might be able to produce crazy amounts of compute, or like it kind of requires a bunch of compute to produce the robots. So I guess that's one story. Another one is we could just all kill ourselves, as in like
Sure.
If a power play system comes along and it creates some lethal pathogens that kill almost everyone, then like economic growth will be pretty slow. Or if we have a misaligned AI that decides that it's it doesn't really want to produce anything else or whatever, it just like has some weird objectives, it just like kills most people, and then just like
it gets kind of depressed.
You're just like I don't know, produces like art for the rest of eternity.
Sure.
If it had some sort of like non-totalizing goal that was sufficient to want to like eliminate. So you have a hegemon that then doesn't have a totalizing goal, you could end up with like no growth.
I was wondering about almost the opposite of international coordination. I mean, one form of quote unquote consumption, or at least an alternative to saving, isn't just like enjoying stuff, but can be like spending on like weapons of war.
Yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily exclusive.
Yeah, right. Well, let's hope they're not overlapping too much.
Yeah, so you could end up, hypothetically imagine equilibrium where like, basically, it's like a, I guess, criticism or something, or maybe it's not quite the right word. So you have a zero-sum games. So I guess, and both parties are like, either they fight today, or they invest and they produce more robots and they fight tomorrow. And the equilibrium is always just fight today, fight today, fight today.
If you invest, you lose.
Exactly.
It's just like so knife edge somehow.
Exactly. I mean, it's not even that crazy to imagine set up being this way. It's like the question is, how much you get more robots tomorrow, so you're better at fighting tomorrow. But like that doesn't require you to like invest less today. And so like is the optimal thing to invest in? It's just like unclear how this works out. And it's like not crazy to imagine it's kind of like abstracted game that like maybe it's best to always be fighting.
It's like a First World War kind of scenario except with drone armies.
All slack is being pushed into like making more robots. Everyone's reaching equilibrium where like if they reinvested less or more, they would end up being a disadvantage. So everyone's investing at the optimal rate of drones, and then it's just like I guess like slowly
it's 3% per year.
There's like a slowly accumulating pile of dead drones on the borders of countries or whatever. I think this is just like unlikely to be stable is basically the main. I mean, so it seems like probably unlikely that it would kind of end up optimized this way. You could imagine situations that optimized where everyone is growing slowly and producing more robots. Or I guess hypothetically they could be shrinking and producing more robots as everyone burns down the
like cannibalizing your economy.
Yeah, exactly, in order to not die. But I think like more realistically, probably like it seems plausible that you would in fact have the solutions that do involve some amount of growth, but there's like, is this stable? Like it seems unlikely you'd end up within a defensive equilibrium where nothing was changing. And basically this physical growth points at like you might think of as like an instability, or like something that's physically possible. Like you can grow very fast. And as long as someone can start growing that fast and be protected or get away with it for a few years, they just end up way bigger than everyone else. And so like, for instance, if there's like a bit of noise or you get lucky and you can manage to defend yourself, or you have an agreement or something like this, even temporarily, you can start to run away, basically. So I think it's kind of hard to imagine this being really stable. Another reason is it requires like a bunch of actors to all be fighting each other to stalemate. And like, well, if someone wins, then they'll win, then they'll just start growing, Yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like there's a lot of dry tinder and there's a possibility of sparks. And then you can like contrive scenarios where you like agree never to make a spark, or somehow you reach some like equilibrium.
Yeah.
But there's a fundamental point that like, it's kind of unstable.
Yeah, it is doable. If any actor does this, they'll end up growing really fast. So I guess like what's another way you can imagine this is avoided? Well, I guess maybe you imagine there's some, again, like if there's a hegemon, I don't know, like space, like a global dictator uses AI to take control of the world, and then again, like just doesn't really have that totalizing goals. Maybe they just like wouldn't bother, like they don't care to do this. But I think a lot of the stories behind why this doesn't really happen seem pretty grim on the face of it. Like people want to have a lot of stuff and prosperity, and so like to avoid that kind of requires a lot of coordination. And maybe there's a hopeful like story about like preventing like AI catastrophes and us growing slowly and wisely. But I think it's more plausible to be more like, actually no, we just have like a dictator, and the dictator just doesn't care to grow fast, and so they just don't. And like or like AI system that takes over and doesn't care, or like we just end up killing ourselves.
I mean, one point that seems worth making is when you are hailing about whether growth rates will be doubling on the order of days or weeks or months, there's a sense in which this is not like a very important question for very long. Because,
well, that's true, because you end up hitting physical limits quite quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it can be quite important for the distribution of power, because if you're behind the curve a little bit, I mean, Tom Davidson, for instance, is a great point where you look at like exponentially growing things are...
You maintain the balance.
You maintain so in absolute terms, the gap grows, but in relative terms, the gap doesn't. Obviously, in practice, that could actually be a big deal. Like it could end up being but in any case, but with these really short growth rates, probably in reality, it'd be a process by which the growth rates become shorter. And so you'd end up with maybe like a very, like basically like one group just kind of runs away with the future before anyone else kind of like notices what's going on.
I mean, it depends, right? Like if there's a global growth rate that is somehow true for everyone, then you would preserve the kind of balance.
Yeah, it's a question of basically like
does growth scale with your size?
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is a question of like internal growth, like how much does your internal growth rate get faster versus how much you couple to other people. The more tightly your growth is coupled to others, either because you're like literally trading with them, or like they steal your shit, like they steal your designs or whatever, or the more it's just like the entire economy kind of grows really fast and maybe super exponentially. Whereas if you don't have those kind of leakages, you could end up with like very big gaps.
Yeah. And I guess there's a more common sense point, which is that if, let's say, doubling times of a week are actually feasible and attainable, then you would need this seeming coincidence that basically every relevant actor achieves those doubling times at the same point in time.
Yeah, it becomes quite fine-tuned, right?
Yeah, and it's like quite easy to imagine just one actor just gets there like 2 weeks ahead of others, and then that's just like a huge deal.
Exactly. And also just like the amount of stuff you have to begin with becomes quite important potentially. So because in these situations, like most of the stuff we have at the moment, like isn't super useful for making these things go really fast. And so like there's differences in like the initial investment rates can matter a lot because it just compound. Like, if you start with double the amount of stuff, if everyone's growing at the same time, then you'll always have double the amount. And like those differences can also just kind of compound over time.
Do you think it's relevant that developed economy like the US is more tilted towards services and other less relevant seeming sectors than more like newly industrialized countries like China, which could therefore have more an advantage?
Maybe. I think it's complicated, basically. I mean, for a start, the question becomes like which sectors really bind you at the beginning, or like my guess is like the bigger question is just like, do you invest early on in the right things rather than like today, do you have the right allocation? So I'm really not sure. It's not something I've looked into like in huge detail, other than I will say a lot of naive advantages you might imagine, I think, will get washed out, or like a lot of like expertise advantages or things like this. It might not matter that much. And once things start growing at serious, like, well, if you have robots that you're using to build factories in like a few months or something, which again is like not that implausible once you actually have like AGI, then like your initial allocation of capital matters only insofar as like you use that to make the initial robots and suddenly
right.
kickstart
it's kind of like a one-off impediment / advantage.
Yeah, but like your like expertise or the existence of like a bunch of like rare earth refineries, like it really matters at the start when you're the only one who has those, or like everyone else is behind, but they'll just build those. Like they'll just be like the most a pretty important thing for them to start building out. So yeah,
I guess it's quite hard to just hide your IP.
Exactly. I mean, I think with AGI, if you did have AGI, it seems implausible that like IP or expertise would be a huge bottleneck. It's not like there's not nothing there, but I just don't think those advantages would be that great. You could imagine compounding IP from like the AIs doing more research. Like you can imagine future technologies being grounded by this, but like anything that currently exists, I'm reasonably skeptical would be.
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess it's worth saying that unfortunately, I don't think that is a reason to expect like shrinking inequality at a global level.
No.
Partly because the fact that you have cheap labor, human labor is just actually no longer relevant. And if you're technologically advanced, you can basically maintain that lead, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about in this full automation world, one which like humans are really not providing like relevant. I mean, it's complicated because at the moment we're looking at like production, physical production, which is distinct from GDP or things like this. I think it's like a really important point I want to make is like you do not need to have full automation to actually fully automate this physical production. Like it does not matter one whit whether like you have hairdressing, robots, right. you know, like the amount of things you need to do in order to like produce scalable energy it's like a lot of processes, but it is like, you know, it doesn't include things like babysitting young children or things like this. And I think a lot of the debate often gets confused by this point, or at least like maybe people are talking past each other because they're talking about different notions of growth. But like, if you want to ask the question, can you get crazy amounts of physical stuff produced? You really should be focusing on the question of whether you can automate the stuff that makes stuff, and not the question of like, can an AI take all of human labor?
Yeah, and I guess it's compatible. So you could imagine a story where the physical industrial economy is vast and growing very quickly, and yet, you know, somehow there are these human intrinsic sectors like hairdressing and like, you know, teaching or like performance arts, which continue to occupy like some meaningful fraction of spending.
Yeah.
It kind of just seems like the relevant thing is just like what's actually happening in the physical world.
Well, I mean, it depends what questions you want to ask, but like, yeah, I think for a lot of questions like military balance, power, for instance, like, yeah, it's the physical world that really matters. And like, I think to the extent to which like GDP doesn't capture this, like GDP is the issue, not the, like, we should just not be using that notion or something, or it's like, it just becomes less relevant. And you can come up with all sorts of contrived models where like various things happen to wages and stuff, because those are, it's just the relationship between that and what's happening on the ground, atom to atom, is kind of complicated. I mean, we know, I think, you know, for a fact, we can say there are some things that will be kind of hard to scale up a lot. Like we won't be producing huge amounts of wheat per day or something, because like it takes physical time to make wheat. In some of my earlier calculations, when especially when I was including lags, the in part 3, the model would decide that the production was bottlenecked by forestry. Because the issue is like, it just takes time to grow a tree and chop it down. And obviously, the resolution here is that you just don't actually need wood.
Yeah, you just reach around it.
You would reach around it. I mean, obviously, that would make a bunch of things harder and more annoying, but like, you know, you don't need these goods. But like, we can actually be pretty confident that we will not have vast production of like milk or cheese or something like this, because like,
right,
it just takes time. The good news is that it doesn't really matter, or like the robots don't really want to be eating Stilton or something. So like
another big claim.
So, you know, you just probably, you know, probably that doesn't matter that much. But you know,
I guess I just want to ask what your actual view is. I mean, presumably a big part of the answer is who knows, very uncertain. But given everything you've said, you know, how does that relate to just your inside view?
Yeah. So my sense. My guess is that maybe, it's very tricky because it depends a lot on questions like, do we get, you know, advanced nanotech, for instance, like, or how much more quickly can you make compute? So if I had to like ask for like, if energy doesn't bottleneck, like what ends up bottlenecking such that you don't get like a month doubling time, like kind of complicated advanced manufacturing of things like computer chips, I think may end up being the thing that is more limiting. And also in terms of the like where the value in the future comes from, which is much harder to define than the physical production, but like the value might be closely connected to how much compute you can do, especially if you imagine like the digital minds, whatever, have more worth, or maybe like you really want to solve advanced math problems or whatever you want to do with that compute. Then it could matter a lot, like how efficiently you can create compute. And like in some sense, the true question you might be most interested in is like how much compute do you have? And questions around like how efficiently you can make compute could be the really, including like energy efficient, could be like the real question. You're like, oh, you only double energy every month. So like you're like, you know, you're tenfolding the amount of compute you have per unit energy every month, and like that's closer to the notion that you should care about. This is all me like trying to sidestep the question, you know. So I don't have to like.
I mean, there is this concrete question of like, okay, at some point in the next potentially few decades, will it be the case that you can look out of your window and the physical world will just be like meaningfully changing in this kind of
Yeah. And if you're rolling out
way,
out the solar panels over every surface,
Yeah.
like you'll see this.
like when will your local
Yeah.
fields get covered in solar panels?
My sense is that, by the point we have AGI, like within months of that, we will probably have massive energy production on the scale of like, to 10xing within a couple years or something.
And AGI being replacing human cognitive labor, but not necessarily robotics, or does that come for free, or what's?
Yeah, so my sense is that, so I'm not really sure. So the question is like, how long does the R&D take and what are the lags here? And I'm not sure about this. It's not something I've looked into yet. I do want to get estimates of this. My intuitive sense is it's not actually that hard to make robots, to be honest. I mean, like, I think I think people overrate the difficulty. I think it's for the simple reason that like, we have always lived in a world where AI systems were not very intelligent, and it's like really hard to get intelligent, actually operating in the world is like really difficult. In particular, because the things that were operating the robots were just not very intelligent, and like it's actually kind of hard to like operate well in the real world if you're not very intelligent.
I guess I can imagine some pushback that sure, maybe the hardware side of robotics is pretty solvable. You can have like fine control servos or whatever. But the robots need to know what to do. A bunch of the kind of process knowledge that is required to swap out for a person in some manufacturing context is currently not on the internet. Really, it's stuck in a person's head. It takes some time to extract it.
I mean, I think this is just like a lack of understanding of how much is on the internet. But even if it's not, like, how much time does it take someone to learn how to do their job properly?
Yeah. Well, okay, like maybe this is really only a lag of weeks to months, but it still seems like a meaningful lag. And it also seems notable that robotics foundation models are lagging the text models, perhaps for this reason, that it's just much harder to extract relevant information.
It's not so clear to me. I mean, I think it's like, plausibly it could take like months for a robot to learn how to operate in the world, but like months just isn't that long or something. I mean, it's also noting with these economic growth, it takes time to actually scale to the full economy. So there's like always a lag here. The current production is like dominated, like current electrical consumption, for instance, is dominated by consumer goods. It doesn't go into reinvestment. And so like it would take time for your electrical production to double, because you would just spend quite a bit of time having to make more machine tools and more. And there'd be a bunch of R&D you'd have to do as well. Like that is like, cost time. So you would have these lags here. So like it might take you, if AGI came tomorrow, it might take a couple years before you like got crazy energy doublings. But like it wouldn't take you decades. And also importantly, once you get the first doubling, the next doubling is really fast, which I think is a point that is often missed.
Yeah, okay.
Because the thing that really lags you is a mixture of R&D costs and building up from a small base, which means that it's kind of hidden because you have a bunch of stuff that isn't growing at the same time.
I guess there's this COVID point again that it will look like not much is happening. Right up until something is very much happening.
So looking at GDP is a bit like looking at how many people have a cold or flu during the start of COVID. And like in the first few months, no one had COVID compared to the number of cold cases. And in fact, you saw a bunch of like idiotic articles, saying, oh, but like only X people have like died from COVID versus, the colds or whatever. And like, but the thing that mattered was not the total number. The fact that colds and flus have been roughly constant over time, and that the number of COVID cases was exponentially increasing.
So in some stylized way, you could say, oh, look, the automated economy that is newly emerging is already growing on the order of doubling every few months or up to a year. The economy as a whole initially is not growing much faster than historical rates. And then that quite quickly switches over when the automated economy takes up a large share of the overall economy.
Exactly. And so if you're looking at total economy, it looks like constant, suddenly like exponential growth. If you're looking at the small sector, you would have seen this a lot further. So I think, if you're interested in like, what would this look like? Well, it will look like probably you'll see like the rollout happening at smaller scales initially, and you'll see like a lot more investment into the kind of physical capital and things like this. Months and years before you really, really have the economy doubling. But like once it is doubling, it'll be doubling really quite fast.
It seems like going right back to the beginning of the conversation, part of the framing is, well, economists don't believe in this, it seems. Given that you're saying it's hard to think of reasons why we wouldn't get these unprecedented growth rates once we have automation of the necessary components, then I guess the economists just need to commit to saying they don't believe in the possibility of automation on short timelines?
I think this is implicitly what they do. I mean, it's a bit hard because I think the economists lack the tools and they lack the ability to even like kind of describe these situations. And it's to do fundamentally with how economics or macroeconomics like kind of works as a discipline. Economists aren't engineers. They do not like look into like economists like abstract away the question of like what physical capital does and like why things grow. You will never find a textbook that will explain to you why like an economics textbook that will explain to you why like capital roughly reproduces itself every year rather than every day or every 10 to 30 years or something. And to the extent that they have something to say about this, it usually ends up being not really rooted in physics, but more other like aspects of the world that are no longer relevant. I mean, even if you imagine dividing the world into capital and labor, and that's your base model, which basically every macroeconomic model does, you've already made a false, like a division that doesn't make sense in the new world where labor is replaceable by capital. It's like the fundamental, like first thing that they would write down is just irrelevant. Like it's like the opening move is quite dumb. And then if you persist in this kind of division, which is no longer sensible, then yeah, you're essentially just assuming away. You're just assuming that you cannot do this. And you can write many words, or you can claim things about like you can say many fancy words to justify this, but like ultimately it is just denying the premise. Which again, like maybe you should take this as reductio ad absurdum that this won't occur, right? Like I think it would be like intellectually a valid thing to do. Oh, kind of. I mean, in reality, like it should be the engineering and the physics telling the economists what's possible. The economists shouldn't be telling the engineers and the physicists what's possible.
Well, I can imagine. I just don't know enough about economics here, right? But I can imagine an economist hearing the engineering reasons that very fast doubling rates would in this world be practically feasible, and then giving some reasons why, in fact, doubling rates would be slower, or the transition would take a long time for kind of interesting reasons to do with Bauman effects or human preferences or whatever. Like I don't know what those reasons are, but
I think the big difficulty is just economics is not super empirically contentful, which is not. I mean this like the precise sense that like the world is just too messy and complicated for economists to answer even basic quantitative questions about it. Like again, like can any economist actually explain why the economy grew at 3% or 2% per year roughly in the last 50, 100 years? Why it grew more like 0.1% during the during the agricultural period? Why the industrial revolution occurred when it did? Like none of these questions are really answerable by economists using the standard tools they do. And this is not like because they're all idiots or whatever. It's just like the basic questions that you would need to quantitatively understand the world are just kind of too complicated for the kind of methods and kind of things that are available. Or in many ways, it's because the problem is like theoretically it's easy to do lots of theory, but there are just too many parameters that are under constrained that like you cannot in fact say that much. You can start to say interesting accounting things, like your economic models allow you to like define some kind of average parameters, and you can kind of get a broad descriptive sense of what's going on. But the models are rarely predictive. They really do not offer quantitative predictions about the world.
Yeah. Okay.
Quantitative in the sense of like, no, you in fact like have some parameter that you derive from some sort of fundamental reasoning, and then you could apply it. You can obviously do curve fitting, or you can say like it makes sense these correlate, and then you could like empirically derive your parameters. But when we do physics, we don't do that. We know fundamentally where the parameters come from, and with like 3 parameters, we can predict gazillions of things, and that's not how economics works.
Yeah. But it is the case that using only the tools of physics, you would have been hard pressed to describe, predict, explain historical growth rates.
Yeah. Right? This is not. I don't think the economists are being dumb here. They're trying to. The problem they're trying to solve is way harder than the problem of.
The claim is that engineering and physics considerations become more relevant for making predictions about the next few decades than the past few decades.
So I think the claim is more along the lines of economists have never tried to solve this problem and they don't have the tools to do so, which is fine. But it's just like it is like a different.
I guess part of what I'm actually wondering is, if you're an economist, should you think, all right, if only I had just like broke out of my stupor and invented new tools, could I like usefully contribute to these questions, or should I just retrain?
Well, no, I mean, like I have used economic. In my modeling, for instance, like input-output tables were developed by economists. And the von Neumann growth rates. All of these are like things that standard tools that, well, kind of, they're tools that economists use. I mean, in the end of the day, it's all like math or something, and it's closely related to math to what is commonly done in economics. I think it's interesting if you look at, for instance, a classic macroeconomic textbook like Asimoglu's, input-output analysis never appears. And so I think there's been a strong disconnect between what is prestigious in macroeconomics and what is useful to understand these things. Because ultimately, if you want to understand how the future would look, you need to understand a lot about the technological details. Like those really matter a lot. But for various reasons, that's not what economists have traditionally, I think, spent much time on. Like generally, there's not huge connections between like the microphysical processes, as you might imagine them, and the kind of like average behavior of the economy. Economists are usually much more interested in questions around like how do people's like preferences or savings rates or operate, and treating the actual industrial processes is very abstracted, which in some sense makes sense as like a division of labor, like that, obviously engineers study how engineering processes work, partly because I think in part because there is a lot you can say, they need to abstract it away. Like as soon as you start getting into the weeds of like aluminum, steel production or whatever, you're just like,
you're not doing economics, you're not going to get published anymore.
Well, it's just too you just like, how can you just like have too many things to say or whatever. It's like, it's a bit like the Feynman quote about the people who try and write down all the equations that govern like an ideal gas, like, for all 10 to the 23 particles. And like, those are the people who don't get very far in the subject. Well, if you want to understand broad questions, like how does innovation matter for like growth, then like there's just only so much you can get if your starting point is, well, the spring disperses this much energy for, it's just like, obviously you need to like close somewhere. But I think a lot of the emphasis in macroeconomics on questions of where innovation comes from is just not relevant anymore. It'd be a bit like economists in 1500 spending all their time looking at like how land restricts, peasant agriculture or whatever, which is just like, makes a lot of sense if you're considering 1500s Europe. It just doesn't matter in 1980s America. Like it no longer became the constraint. And so like...
Which is not to say the kind of accounting identities of economics stop holding, or that the models are not in some sense applicable. It's just,
or even the broad math, like math still applies.
Abstracting the wrong things that cover up a lot of the action.
Like your intuitions as to what parameters matter and don't are not necessarily helpful anymore. A bit like, if in physics, it's just if you want to understand how really viscous fluid works, then you go on to want to understand how like an airplane flies. Like in some sense, it's still the same math, but like, honey just acts very differently from the stratosphere, and therefore you should not design your like submersible vehicles in the same way as you design your airplanes. And
another big insight from you. Let's wrap up soon. I'm aware of the time. I guess I want to ask, do you plan to do more work on this? What's the next thing to think about?
Yeah, so here I can, I guess, over promise and maybe under deliver, but hopefully deliver more. I mean, what's interesting to go on further? I mean, so energy production doesn't seem to... I'd kind of hoped when I was looking at the energy initially that it would like, you couldn't produce faster than 6 months, because then I'd have the answer. I'd be like, well, I lower bounded it at a year, I upper bounded it at 6 months.
Right.
Problem solved. Yeah. Like, it wasn't so hard after all. And now I'm looking, it's like, seems like energy production actually can be a lot faster than this. Maybe not infinitely fast, but, I'm assuming like engineering and physical constraints. And like, you could even quibble with a lot of those, or you can imagine like trying to get past that. So one question is like, okay, like, pull out all the stops. You have like crazy nanotech or whatever. Like, can you do better than this energy production system? And I think it's like kind of unclear at the moment to me. Transporting the energy long distance just seems very hard. So maybe you just have some sort of like no-go of like, well, yeah, as long as everything's hyper localized, you're fine. But like, you just can't be transporting things, which maybe is fine. It would be a very weird looking world, like when you're trying to think about production. Another question is going the other way. Okay, so maybe energy production, binds you to a month, but not slower. Are there other things that it would actually bind fast? One thing that might be hard is compute, or at least like at the moment, computer chips are like kind of expensive to produce. They're not crazy expensive in terms of like dollar in, dollar out, but in terms of the lag there, it just takes like, both the chips themselves take months to produce, because there's literally thousands of physical processes that have to occur where these photomasks you have to put on, you have to like, it's quite an elaborate process. And if you look at it, you're like, these people are like not idiots. Like there's a reason that they do all these extremely expensive, complicated processes.
Yep.
It's unclear how much better you would do if you're designing things. So I think compute's quite interesting. Also, the fabs themselves are expensive to build as well. So like it just takes months to make a single chip, and it takes many years to build a fab. And so just to end up bottlenecking things. It's tricky because unlike energy, you don't have the same... It's less clear there's like some sort of like core like need for compute. Like you don't need that much compute to build this solar system I outlined. Like, all the R&D is kind of done. You obviously need to like, have your tractor move around. You have to move things and stuff, but it's not like...
I was going to say, it's kind of it's an obvious point, but it's worth remembering there's like a very big difference between chips you need to do frontier AI training and inference and the like on-device chip you need to just like control some robotic system or whatever.
Yeah, and you also may get situations where, I mean, if AI progress continues, it might not be that expensive to run an intelligent system.
Yeah.
And also, if the lags really become problems for you, you can always just regress to making cheaper chips. I mean, there's two parts to it. One is that like, even like a year lag, it's pretty painful. If doubling time is every 3 months or whatever, it basically makes everything like 20 times more expensive. Which, if your chips are like more than a 20th of the economy, means the chips hard bind. But if your chips are like naively only like 1% of the economy, then like, okay, now they're 20th of the economy. That obviously like slows things down, but it's not actually that expensive. Like, it only becomes expensive once the combined cost and the lag blows you up. And so I think it's like not actually as binding as you might naively think. And then, yeah, you're right. There's like a lot you could do to make it cheaper. So like you might just regress to making cheaper chips, for instance, and that might just be a good trade-off in that world. One reason we want expensive chips is they're energy efficient. But like, whoa, energy, well, maybe it's not so expensive after all. Well, just make make 2005 chips or something, or 2015 chips. Like,
and there is, you can just trade off.
Yeah.
Cruder, cheaper chips with more expensive ones. Currently, it's economical for frontier applications to use the best chips, but that might change if you're bottlenecked by the very best chips.
So it all depends on like what is in fact the bottleneck. So that's one thing. Another question I'm pretty interested in is the like R&D question. I mean, this is tricky to answer because again, it partly involves this question of what's the trade-off between like compute and like, I guess, intelligent behavior in the world, or like, so I'm not quite sure, but I think there's an interesting question of, for instance, like the solar panel perovskite system. Like you would need to do some sort of like R&D. Like how long would that take? And I'm not sure. I think it's pretty unclear. It's also important when thinking about things like biorisk, which is what traditionally I spent a lot of time thinking about, where like how long would it take you to either do pretty horrible things, like how much R&D effort is needed, but on the flip side, like how much R&D effort is actually needed to like design a cure. Like one point for why this might be not actually very bottlenecking is just like not many people spend their time actually doing R&D in the current economy. And there is actually quite a lot of compute, like enough compute to be the equivalent of, I think if you very naively did the comparison, like millions of people already, which is tiny compared to the global population, but like large compared to the population of people doing R&D effort, basically. Furthermore, a lot of R&D effort is just like is not very it's like focused. Like we do R&D on like a lot of different things, which makes sense. Like, there are a lot of different products that optimizing a little bit could be good, but like in a future where things have radically changed, then like the value of either, R&D on making AI smarter, for instance, is one example, or like making chips really cheap or making energy really cheap. The ROI on that could just get way higher than everything else. And furthermore, human specialized workers are kind of annoying. Like you have some people who like study like random organic chemistry process for whatever reason, and then they've spent years specializing in that. And like you can't just like, get that guy to like now all of a sudden like make, really spectacular art or something. Like he's too specialized. Whereas AI systems, the compute itself is like much more fungible. So you end up in situations where like you can just allocate much more efficiently the workers. And I could imagine, it seems plausible to me that the current allocation of R&D intellectual capital is just like quite inefficient.
Yeah. The idea would be like, hey, currently there's this like one bottleneck to growing the entire economy. We're just going to copy the weights from the like most specialized model, just to all of the like free computes, and just massively scale up the effort at the margin on any given bottleneck.
And you see this, like how many AI R&D researchers are there, for instance? Like I think it's the order of like tens of thousands or something, maybe like depending on how loosely you define, maybe close to like 100,000. Like even just compared to the number of intellectual workers on the planet, it's,
Yeah, and you can dial up the wages as has been done.
There's a huge dial up of the wages.
But the elasticity just isn't there. Like,
yeah, you just can't turn like a 45-year-old chemistry professor into an equivalent 45-year-old AI specialist, even though like probably like plausibly there are many chemistry professors who had the aptitude and ability and would have in different circumstances made great AI researchers. You just can't do that.
I wanted to actually ask you about the research process. You have written about using AI in your research, using Claude. Yeah, I kind of want to hear more about how you're using Claude. How helpful was it?
Yeah, I'll say basically in the last couple months, the Claude has gone from like not that useful to extremely useful for some of the research I do. So, I mean, basically this input-output table analysis. It'd been something I've been working on with a fellow researcher, Konstantin, last year, and another one, Adin, and we had known that these input-output tables existed and like that you could potentially try and do this growth rate analysis, and that you could, find the tables online at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but they're very annoying to actually deal with. I mean, for a start, there's just like a lot of jargon. There's a lot of questions about like how the accounting works. Like it's just like there are subtle questions about what accounting is being done, and also just where you find the tables of data and like how you combine them together. And so we hadn't done that, partly for that, partly just because we had other things to do. Basically in April, because I'd kind of like thought I could do this sort of analysis, but it just seemed like it'd be like weeks and weeks of work. And then I'd been playing around with Claude Code. I'd used it for some personal projects, and I decided to try and use it to do this analysis. And it basically like spent 20 minutes thinking about it, downloaded the tables, and then actually spat out like a very preliminary version of the analysis. And now there was a lot of issues or errors or whatever, but what I found is like as long as I could describe the basic idea of the analysis and the basic vibe of the analysis and basically what to do, like it was pretty good at then getting the like correct, oh, this is like what exactly needs to happen, this is the code that needs to happen, and then write like hundreds of lines of code and to download all the data sets and then do the analysis. And it's interesting because it is very spiky. So for tasks in which you could imagine like kind of describing to like an intern in like half a page what to do, and then like it might be a lot of work, like it's a huge amount of work for a human to like go find all the right tables, download them, scrape them, like turn them into a format that in fact you can ingest into Python, work out which mathematical analyses you need to do, and to import the right NumPy libraries, and to basically do it all. But all of this is like in some sense like pretty standard as long as you have the right idea to begin with. And then the model could just like go and do and produce an analysis. And then there was, quite a bit of back and forth with the model. For instance, when I added labor, it took quite a bit of effort to get the model to do this correctly. So it's very strange because in some sense it seems extremely intelligent that it could just like go and spit out the basic like free labor analysis, like without me giving it very much at all. But then it would like just kind of stumble over like really basic facts. Like I spent a lot of time trying to get it to. In part two, you just need to solve this problem of like how fast can the economy grow from the present day conditions. And in some ways it would like snap and like, work out exactly what tools to use to analyze this and do it quite fast. But then it would make like really dumb errors. Like it would get confused that the economy could never grow because if you look at the current input-output tables, the US obviously imports some goods. And so the model would just see that there was like some negative good, like there was some good that couldn't be accounted for, and it would just decide that growth was impossible, and be like, no, Claude, like I'm pretty sure like growth can occur, and then it would think about it for being like, oh yeah, you're right, like I guess it can occur, but then it would forget about this again, and some cycles of it just doing like really bizarre assumptions. I went through a fun phase where it would try and optimize the economy by doing things like shoving all of the workers into the government services. Because government services, the input-output tables for, I think they only count private property. So for accounting reasons, government services didn't have any physical capital right. associated with them. So Claude was like, oh yes, the best way to make the economy huge is just to put every robot into the government services. And then it would look at the energy output, which would basically be non-existent, and be like, oh, I guess the economy can't really grow. And Claude, it's like... able to like do all the mathematical analyses to produce this result, and not smart enough to be like, hang on a sec, maybe putting 10 million robots into the government.
Yeah.
So Claude for president? Not yet.
Not quite yet. Yeah. And so how are you spending most of your time when you're doing this research? Are you basically babysitting like a bunch of instances of Claude code?
Yeah, it varies a bit. But basically I have Claude code up, and sometimes I'll have like a main Claude that I talk to, and then we'll be doing like kind of parallel analyses from that main Claude where for instance, when I was doing this, like, how fast can the economy grow over time as part two analysis, there's a point where I just wanted to, like, optimize the code. And so I was to one Claude, we were coming up with ideas for optimizing the code, and then just having sub-agents, like, spun off and off and off. And the great thing about this is, like, you can just have 5 sub-agents try different strategies in parallel for the code. And, like, if one of them does something really dumb and gets confused, as long as it doesn't, like, delete the main files or whatever, you're fine. Like it is, like, it's quite good. Like, this is quite a good way to parallelize it. And similarly, when trying to think about how the solar production energy production could work. You could like parallelize a bunch of this by having agents look at different parts and then have red teaming agents look. And then only like look myself once I've had like a bunch of agents in red team and so forth. I find when writing, you kind of need to hold them on a pretty tight leash. And, if I want to like write or edit something, I'll usually be working with a single instance of Claude and being quite careful and very careful about what's in the context, because I find that their performance can degrade. It can be very hit and miss. It's sometimes like sessions just seem like they go badly for reasons that just aren't very clear. And like you also end up like sometimes it just does a really good job at like rewording things, or, like coming up with issues, and then other times it'll just come up with stupidest stuff. It's a very
Yeah, I guess I found in my own work that if you tried to just automate the main tasks that I currently do, it's going to be bad at a bunch of them. But it's worth discovering the tasks that it's surprisingly capable at that I wouldn't currently do because it'd be incredibly labor intensive.
Yeah.
But are now just like close to free. And so you need to like shift the portfolio of what you're actually doing in your work or in your research.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think in particular, analyzing, like doing like kind of well-defined analyses on data sets is like basically free nowadays. And like scraping and knowing data sets pretty cheap. And in some sense, the whole logic behind, part 1 and part 2 and part 3, even to some extent, was just basically like, well, I can just do this analysis now. Like, it would have taken me weeks before. And it's like actually just very, very cheap.
Yeah. There's a sentence in your post about using Claude, which, if I remember right, said something like, it's a little sad that before the AIs, you spend a bunch of time just kind of crunching the numbers and going through these like mechanical processes. There could be a time to like, let your mind drift or just like ease off the decision fatigue. But now you're basically managing a bunch of, grad student equivalents or whatever. And it's just constant decision making. There's not much time to just do the like routine work anymore. It's a very different world.
This is particularly true if you, especially as you try to do a bunch of stuff in parallel, where you can end up with a bunch of different agents all being like, exactly. And the things that they find hardest are going to be the most annoying decisions, or the places they make the dumbest decisions are generally the places we care the most, or you're often just
quite
finding
subtle what they're doing wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And often I feel like you have the experience of like, okay, I mean, like for instance, even in part 1, like, I kind of like in 20 minutes of me just like basically typing a couple times, it had come up with like the basic analysis. But then there was a huge tail of me just like fixing stuff. Or, it was a constant thing of like discovering that it kind of done something dumb, and like it kind of like it done some dumb approximation and it hadn't told me, or like there's a lot of times where I was like, okay, so like let's estimate this, and like go and do it, and like produce a reasonable number, and I'm like, okay, what data did you use? And you're like, oh, I made it up. And the Claude like, okay, but like, do we have this data already? And think about it. It's like, oh yeah, it's in this table that I downloaded 5 minutes ago. I'm like, Claude, why would you? Why would you?
Unbelievable.
Like, you know the table exists. What? Like, what are you doing, Claude?
Yeah.
It's just like, no human would ever like do that.
Yeah, there's something about getting a taste for where the models mess up versus where they can be trusted, which does just seem increasingly important.
It's tricky though, because it also does just change. But I definitely run into like the model wanting to fabricate things quite a lot. I mean, Ryan Greenblatt has like a great article from like a month ago about the model seem misaligned. And like this definitely vibes a lot with my And as one example, they just don't have a good sense of time. Like they do not know what time is. So with the optimizing, for instance, it just took a long time for me to get it to optimize code, because it would, I'd be like, Claude, this is taking like 20 minutes to run. Can you help make it faster? Okay, let me run the code to see why it's slow.
Which works in both directions, right? Because often Claude code will still tell you like, you sure about doing this? It'll probably take about a week.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly.
And then it just does it in 3 minutes.
And it flips both ways. So like it'll be like, oh, let's optimize the code. Sit there for 20 minutes, nothing happens, because obviously the code is running. I know it's slow, and like, I'll check on it and be like, oh, it has done nothing for 3 hours because it has run the code, made a minor tweak, run it again, done a minor tweak, and Claude, please like just make the problem like 1/10 of the size and solve it in like a minute and iterate. Don't like, but it just like has no sense of that. And then the reverse. It just makes up time estimates for how long things will take, and they have no connection to reality. There's really
I guess they have some connection to like human software engineering, which they've been trained on in some sense.
But another one I've noticed is that if you say that you want to get something done, or there's a deadline or whatever, it becomes really obsessive. Like especially like oh, but this will take weeks or whatever. If I accidentally say like, oh, I'm like trying to like, put this draft out today or whatever, it'll start being really lazy and coming up with reasons why like, oh, we could do that, but like your deadline will slip. There's no time. I've even had it when I was like talking about to Claude and I had like a meeting coming up and you had a meeting where it would just become obsessed with this notion that I was about to miss the meeting. Even though the meeting was like half an hour away, it just end every message with, but run off to your meeting now. Like, Claude, like, you've got 20 minutes. Like, I'm not running late for this meeting, please. And they just don't experience the world we do.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I have some, because it's easy to give them the time. And I have some theory that maybe one of the reasons they don't seem to have this is maybe that they get overly obsessed with the time if the interface makes it too obvious to them. A general issue with the models is that it's very much like a play. Like if there's a gun placed on the mantelpiece in Act 1, it must be shown in Act 3.
Right.
Like if you tell the model something, it will tend to assume that it's like pretty important. And it'll like read in between the lines, which it's like actually quite impressive many times. Like it will happily read between the lines quite intelligently in situations where it needs to or whatever. But it also means that it'll go through these like kind of insane deductions where it's like, well, he said this, but this was mentioned, but the only reason that would come up, and like, no, it was just happened to be in the drive.
Yeah.
Don't overthink this, Claude.
Very strange world that we're in. Okay, we should wrap up. Are there any final thoughts you have, or I don't know, open questions you'd like people to work on?
I mean, I think it'd be great for more people to be just working on these kind of questions in general. I think people often have the intuition that things in the physical world will take a long time. And I think this is like often just in part a degree of laziness. Like people at the AI labs, for instance, they often seem to have a tendency to want to minimize the amount to which...
Yes, it'll solve cancer maybe, it'll help with medical advances. This stuff is significantly, I think, less like sexy or like less kind of straightforwardly good to talk about.
I would say we talked a lot about like massive prediction. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing. And like for instance, like if you have a misaligned AI taking control over some fraction of the economy, this suggests they could just grow a lot faster. And they could grow a lot faster because they no longer care about catering to human consumption. They no longer care about the environment, things like this. So like,
for what it's worth, just to state the obvious, like these scenarios of like 6-month doubling times, like steampunk solar powered rollouts across any available piece of land. They're not, at least to me, very gut level exciting. In fact, they're quite scary.
We paved the Sahara in thin film to make more aluminium smelting facilities. It's not like, it's not my image of a bright and glorious future. I mean, it could be part of a bright and glorious future, but I think like it's actually pretty scary to imagine that, especially misaligned AI factions, for instance, might just not be bound with the same kind of norms or considerations. Like, it seems plausible to me that we probably won't pave the Sahara in thin films if humans have control over it, because like we just like having natural ecosystems not completely wrecked. And it was kind of, I mean, going through the math of like how many resources you need and things like this, it's like, you definitely didn't need that many, but it's pretty easy to just end up burning like a ton of CO2. For instance, like I was assuming a solar panel built out, but like, I don't know, like if you're really racing to produce things quickly, like gas may be a better option. And if you do use gas to get your energy, you will just be burning a lot of fossil fuels. Likewise, like just all the activity from the mining and smelting and things like this. I mean, you just will produce a lot of waste products. It will be quite...
Yeah, for what it's worth, I share this sense that arguments around accelerated growth are just being totally slept on, even among people who are worrying about AI progress, and certainly among the wider world and policymakers and so on. If your question is, okay, sure, I see that AI might get like a bit smarter, and like maybe we'll have robots and like self-driving cars, like whatever, what's the big deal? This, I think, is to a significant extent the answer. Like the world will transform in these kind of viscerally quite high stakes and scary ways. If
any group or faction wants to do this. And the thing is, because hard power is in large part driven by possession of energy and machines and things like this, if by the point that a faction was producing large amounts of energy, if they wanted to devote those to drones, for instance, the like military drones, then it would be very hard for other people to stop that. Or like, I think that's an important way. It's quite different from, I guess, like many resources. Like these are the things you do, like these are things you do need or would be very useful to gain a military advantage, or to at least gain enough of a defensive advantage that no one is going to stop you doing this in your part of the world.
Yep. More work needed, as always. Okay, Damon Binder, thank you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here.